Welcome to the Responding to Rising Waters in Southwest Florida webinar. We are so pleased that all of you could join us today for this incredible day full of informative presentations and interactive question and answer sessions with you, our audience. Next slide, please. The once predicted climate changes are now occurring, with the headline in the Washington Post reading America's New Normal, a degree hotter than 2 decades ago, coming from a recently released NOAA report, where you can see on the graph on the left that Florida is one of the most affected states in the United States. These past couple of years, there's been more evidence of increased intensity of storms, sea level rise, and other climate impacts being felt across the globe. In fact, the 2020 Atlantic hurricane season had 30 named storms, the most storms on record, with 6 of those being major hurricanes, like the Category 4 Hurricane Laura pictured here. While the challenge is immense and the window of opportunity to curtail it is narrowing, we are seeing growing awareness and acceptance that is manifesting into bipartisan actions at all levels of government. Next slide, please. We have a great lineup of panel presenters on the agenda today, starting with a presentation on the coastal effects of climate change with Doug Marcy, assessing flooding vulnerability due to sea level rise by Dr. Michael Savarese, use of engineering with nature by Dr. Jeffrey King, reducing disaster suffering with David Marstad and Andy Neal, and building resilience in Broward County by Dr. Jennifer Gerardo. We will end the webinar with a panel of presenters from a group of local climate advocacy groups to discuss goals and objectives. Next slide, please. The Coastal and Heartland National Estuary Partnership is pleased to be the host of this event. Just a little bit about us. We were formed back by Congress in 1995 under the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and we're a partnership of local, state, and federal entities working together with private organizations and nonprofits on natural resource management, our mission being to unite Central and Southwest Florida to protect water and wildlife. Our partnership includes 10 counties and spans over 5,000 square miles. Next slide, please. Finally, we want to introduce you to Menti, a web tool that we'll be using today to collect your questions and comments throughout the event. If you could please take out a smartphone or open another browser web page on your computer and enter in menti.com. Once the page has opened, you're going to want to enter this code, 22912284. You'll see it on the screen here. When you see the Menti page open, asking for your questions, you can feel free to enter your anonymous responses. Those will be live streamed to our presentation screen with all the other responses being received live at the end. And we will be using this platform to handle our question and answer presentations after each presentation today. So again, the website, if you didn't catch that, is menti.com, menti.com, and the code is 22912284. And you'll see that in the chat window as well if you want to open your chat. All right, next slide, please. So our first presentation of this afternoon will be the coastal effects of climate change, assessing impacts of sea level rise on the Southeast by Mr. Doug Marcy, the Coastal Hazard Specialist for NOAA, Office of Coastal Management in Charleston, South Carolina. Next slide, please. Doug Marcy was former hydraulic engineer with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and currently works on flooding and sea level rise geospatial mapping projects, storm surge assessments, and coastal hazards assessment projects, contributing to more disaster resilient communities. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Doug.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you for inviting me to speak with you guys today and kick off this should be a really informative webinar. I'm pretty passionate about the topic. I've been with NOAA almost 20 years working on flooding issues, and I'm looking forward to kicking this off and getting the conversation started. So what I'd like to do is go quickly through a kind of a climate change 101, and talk about sea level change at kind of starting at the global level and then zooming down into what's going on in the Southeast based on some of the newer climate assessments being done, and then eventually to your area of interest in Southwest Florida and Southern Florida. Next slide, please. So a lot of this, I'm borrowing graphics from the National Climate Assessment. We are now in our 4th National Climate Assessment. Every 4 or 5 years, the executive branch has to produce a State of the Science report to Congress about climate change. And you can see here a lot of the indicators that we are using. Some of the arrows are going up as we see increased temperature, more heat waves, heavier precipitation. And then some of the arrows are actually going down, Arctic sea ice, and some of the snowpack, things like that. So we're definitely seeing these changes and trends. Part of what the assessment does is looks at historical information and uses that to determine, are we indeed seeing change? And as you can see, sea level rise is one of those arrows that's going up. Next slide. What's driving most of the climate change we are seeing is the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It has gone up and down over the past 800,000 years, but we are well over where we've ever been, above 400 parts per million. That was back in 2017. We're higher than that now. So our biggest challenge is to reduce the amount of carbon, because that is indeed causing temperatures to warm and thus causing sea level to rise. Next slide. We can see this in trends looking at land temperature, going back to the late 1800s after the Industrial Revolution, and sea temperature. There's a little bit of a lag because the ocean is absorbing a lot of the heat we're seeing in the atmosphere, but there's starting to see the increase in ocean heat content, which is leading to global sea level rise. Next slide. One of the things that we try to look at in the climate assessments and global climate models, you're probably familiar with IPCC. There's a new one just came out, AR6, annual assessment AR6, and it looks at climate models, and they're kind of scenarios of what are we going to do with in the future when in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. You see here, this was from the NCA4. We had 3 different scenarios. One was sort of business as usual, the red curve. Then you have other scenarios where we would start to reduce greenhouse emissions and sort of level off the temperature increase. And then 2.6 is a very kind of optimistic, assuming we would stop everything now and things would level off sooner. So it all depends on what we decide to do in terms of the emissions. Go ahead. And looking at historical sea level rise, yes, it's gone up and down, but you can look at the top graph here and see that going back 2,000 years or so before it started going up again, we've been fairly stable. So a lot of where civilization started to build next to the coast due to the coastal resources and shipping and commerce, sea level has been fairly static. And not until the late 1800s, we've seen this major increase, and we're starting to really start to accelerate. And we'll show you that in some of the local data sets in a little bit. Next slide. So our challenge is to try to assess what's going to happen in the future. We can look at trends based on tide gauges from around the world, and since 1993, satellite altimetry, and we can try to project what's going to happen in the future based on some of these greenhouse gas scenarios. This was from the NCA4. We're going through an update of that process now, and NCA5 will be coming out in a year or so. There's a group looking at kind of refreshing these scenarios, so they will probably change, and that's kind of how climate science works. The more we find out about our climate science and ice sheet interactions and ocean atmosphere interactions, we're going to continue to change that, hopefully narrow the gap. But the red box is sort of the mean in there, somewhere between, this is globally, 1 to 1.5 meters by 2100. Next slide. The 3 key messages that came out of the National Climate Assessment and that's related for the coastal areas. One is that we're already seeing coastal economies at risk. It's increasing, it's costing us more money. Under some of the higher scenarios. This is going to continue to happen. And you can just look at some of the graphs that we're seeing cumulative increases in costs exponentially with the increase in temperature causing more flooding events. And of course, there's a picture we actually used in that from Miami Beach. Next. The second one has to do with changing coastal environments, everything from the natural world, the reasons we like to live where we do. We have the resources, we have the shellfish, we have the fishing, the tourism, but we also are starting to see, impacts that will affect that, like the bleaching of coral reefs. We're also seeing migration of species, including like mangroves farther north. But also on the infrastructure side, this is an example of Norfolk Navy base. It's becoming a serious threat to national security as well. Next. And then third, we're starting to see that social equity is becoming a big issue now. A lot of the communities in the South Pacific, for instance, and the islands are experiencing some of the worst impacts of sea level rise, and they never really contributed at all to the greenhouse gas problem. What's going to be challenged is the legal framework, and I think that's going to be what they're saying is that's going to happen on the coast first. Who pays for the risk? And that's something that we've always had to try to contend with when it comes to coastal versus inland flooding. Who pays for the risk for people to live in high risk areas? Next. So focusing in on the Southeast, which is the chapter that I was a co-author on, my specific expertise was in key message 2, and that is that increasing flood risk in the Southeast and low-lying regions. So we are basically saying that flood risk along the coast is going to continue, coastal flooding will continue, but also low-lying areas, even inland with extreme rainfall, are going to start to see same thing, continued impacts. And of course, the interaction between inland and coastal regions is sort of compound flooding area where you have extreme rainfall events at the same time you have high tide and surge going on, is causing communities a lot of problems. Next. What causes sea level to change? This is kind of 101 physics here, but what we've seen a lot of is the increase in the heat content of the ocean is causing the ocean water to expand, thus increasing the volume. We have a lot of local things going on, like subsidence in places like Louisiana, some of the highest subsidence rates in the country. We have issues with groundwater, such as in South Florida, with the limestone there and the aquifers. And then, of course, the exchange of the land-based ice with the ocean and the redistribution of that mass causing sea level to increase. Next. And the biggest source of uncertainty has been how fast are the ice sheets going to melt. You can see most of the sea level rise we've seen globally has been from expansion of the ocean, some from Greenland, less from Antarctica. And how this plays out, what's going to contribute when, is a huge factor and a big part of the different the range in the sea level rise curves you see. Next. Sea level is also not rising the same rate everywhere at any given time or decade. You can see from this graphic that sometimes the water piles up on one side of the ocean basins versus another, based on trade wind, dominant wind directions, Pacific decadal oscillation, Atlantic decadal oscillation. So there's natural variability at any given moment. Go ahead, next slide. And what we try to do is take into account the oceanographic factors, vertical land motion in local areas, but also when the ice sheets start to melt, the redistribution of that mass is going to make the water sit differently on the planet. And that's going to also affect where we see sea level rise faster or slower than other places relative to their distance away from the ice sheets. Next. Land motion is a big part of it. We're starting to try to focus a little bit more on this, and we've had to use the tide gauges that we have around the country. But we're trying to fill that in with some other technologies, working with NASA on like INSAR and IFSAR technologies. But we can see this makes a big difference. You see the high arrows there. Sea levels rising much faster in areas where the land subsiding. Some places like in Alaska and up in Canada, that sea level is actually going down relative to the land because it's rising after the past glacier. Next. So there's a lot of components that make up sea level rise. You can see them all listed here. You don't pay attention to the numbers, but it's a complicated thing. The ocean's warming, the glaciers are going to add, just from the alpine glaciers, Greenland, Antarctica, how much water, land storage is going on, and then vertical land motion. All that has to be taken into account. And all of that affects you at the local level differently from another location. Next. So let's drill down on what's going on. This is from Vaca Key on the Keys. We've got data going back to 1971, which is the year I was born, incidentally. And you see we've had 1.28 feet on average in the last 100 years. It's about 0.15 inches a year. Next. A little bit farther up near Virginia Key, which is near Miami Beach. You see we've got a lot more data there going back to 1930, almost a foot in the last 100 years. So we have seen this, but you can also see that there's ups and downs in this blue line. So it's not a smooth line. We can draw a line through it there as a regression to give us the sort of the average, but at any given time it goes up and down. Next. But what we've been seeing, for example, at Key West, is a trend that's no longer linear. If you're a math person, you remember your quadratic equations. We're starting to see these are actually mimicking the curves that we have in our projections. They're no longer what we call stationary. So you can't rely on the last 100 years or whatever of data to tell us what's going to happen the next 100 years. So this is when it becomes important to looking at future flood risk. We can't rely on what the past has told us. Next. For scenarios to use, this is what locals want to know, right? Which one do I use? Well, what we try to do is look at what's called a risk management strategy, which would be, for your higher risk tolerance places that you can afford to have flooding every once in a while, like open spaces, there's lower consequence, greater flexibility, then you might want to use a lower scenario. But for places with high criticality, like airports, not flexible, inability to change, hardened structures, things like that, then we're going to have to use a higher scenario when we do planning. Next. I'll give you an example. This is from Charleston, South Carolina, where I live. They have a sea level wide strategy, and what they're looking at is going out 50 years and looking at a 2 to 3 foot planning horizon, if you will, kind of like a freeboard. 2 foot for less critical infrastructure and 3 for more critical. And that's a sliding scale they're going to evaluate probably every 10 years, or at least every time, maybe even every time the projections are updated. But you can see we're following right along the intermediate curve there. Next. And if you look at Virginia Key and Vaca Key, and I apologize for the lines are pretty small on here, but you can basically see we haven't added in the last bit of data to 2020, but it's tracking right along the green line there, the intermediate high. I'm sorry, the intermediate. Next. High tide events. This is where we're starting to see it's actually happening in our lifetime, and we can track this. The physics behind this is basically whenever we have a new moon and a full moon, the moon is lined up on the same side or the opposite side as the sun, causing a higher tidal bulge. We have higher tides. That's happened for millennium. But what is starting to happen, next slide, is that we're pushing up over thresholds because sea level has risen, and our existing infrastructure is starting to be overwhelmed by even high tide events. These are a couple of examples. The one on the right was just used in the opening of this webinar. Next. We start to track this with Noaa. We look at the tide gauge there. This is an example in Miami Beach. We can see the number of high tide events based on the thresholds that we set. It's using some statistically based observations to try to normalize it across the country so we can start to count the number of times we're starting to have high tide flooding and use it as an actual indicator for sea level rise and climate change. You see the number of events has increased going back to the starting in the 90s. Next. And we do a high tide flooding outlook every year. My colleagues at co-ops, our Center for Operational Oceanographic Products and Services, we put out a report and looks at projected number of high tide flooding days. And you can see as we go using an intermediate scenario going out to 2050, we're going to have a lot more of those. And we've started to map the impacts of those, the minor, moderate, and major areas that will be experiencing the impacts. Next. Also, future precipitation is going to change. This is again from NCA4, and you can see down here in the southeast, we've got with a higher emission scenario, much more chance of extreme precipitation. So not so much that the mean rainfall over the year is going to change, but the upper end, the rain bombs, if we call them that, are going to be increasing. And that is the rain rate is really what causes flooding issues, pluvial flooding in urban areas. Next. So we have areas on the coast like this that have, let's say, a seawall built up. You can have high tides and even wind waves and surge backing up into the storm drains and rainfall happening at the same time. This overwhelms the stormwater systems that weren't designed to handle both the tidal and the increasing rainfall that it was designed for. Most stormwater systems are designed for a 25-year event. Well, if you believe in non-stationarity, the 25-year event is no longer the case. Maybe more like the 50-year or so event. Next. Hurricanes, we deal with this. We have to. They're going to continue. This is just an example of all the hurricanes we have. NOAA actually has a international best tracks data set that looks at all the hurricanes around the globe. Next, and we can see that increased heat content. This is out of the NCA Southeast chapter for Irma. There was so much warm water at the surface, but it's also not just at the surface. It's deeper, depth water, warmer water that's going to cause higher intensity storms. We don't know if they're necessarily going to be more, but they will probably be more intense because of some of the heat and content increasing. Next. And what that is going to do is increase the expansion of the floodplain. If the floodplain was mapped in 2010, as you see at the top, an increased sea level is going to basically be an exacerbator of future flooding. The storms will still be happening, the waves will still be happening, but that's going to push up the water levels to go farther inland. And the thresholds that we know now are going to be impacted and overwhelmed more and more as we go forward. Next. Disasters are costing us a lot more. You can see this from $1 billion disasters. We haven't gone through 2021 yet. Major increase in what this is costing us. Next. America's coasts are we have 40% of the population, 10% of the land mass, but we produce an awful lot of goods and services and employ an awful lot of people. Next. Especially our ports. This is becoming a big deal in the news right now. You can't get enough ships in the ports. It's a supply chain issue. If the ports go down because of storm surge or waves or other flooding issues, it's a big deal. Next. And that isn't just for the folks that live on the coast. If you shut off the ports of New Orleans or Long Beach, it connects to every part of the country, almost like a heart does to all the arteries and capillaries. Next. Even the housing industry is taking notice. This is from Zillow, looking at the impacts, how many homes would be underwater. So the real estate industry is also taking notice. The economic impacts are becoming real for everybody. Next. This is me at my desk every day. What are we going to do? It seems overwhelming, but I just wanted to kick off the conversation next with a very important concept, and that is resilience, which is the ability to prepare and plan for, absorb, recover from, and more successfully adapt. So this is build back better and smarter. This is change the way you're doing things because they're not working now. That's that kind of, instead of just being robust, building something robust, let's build it resilient. Next. We have steps that there's a lot of different ways to put this, but basically we want to identify what the problem is. We're going to hear presentations to talk about determining the vulnerabilities, looking at options, looking at cost benefit, but looking at cost benefit in a different way than just the infrastructure. What about the ecological component? What about the nature-based and the ecosystem services component? And then finally, to take action. Next. And one of the things NOAA has really been trying to help with in this is risk communication training. We provide a lot of training courses. We make a lot of data and tools available for decision makers. We try to build capacity for action and leadership and convene and leverage partnerships, just like this group that's meeting today. Next. Digital Coast is just a resource that we have that we try to house a lot of our data. We have a lot of information like LiDAR data that can be used for elevation mapping, land cover changes, imagery. Next. We have a lot of different tools, including our sea level rise viewer. We have a land cover change tool. We have snapshots, a host of different tools that help folks identify their potential vulnerabilities. Look next. And also we have some risk communication training and other training courses, as well as providing technical assistance to communities and to coastal programs that need assistance with things just like we're talking about today, with how to implement sea level rise projections and scenarios. And with that, I think I'm wrapped up. Yep.
Well, thank you, Doug. If you would mind muting, we will now for a moment let everyone have a chance to log in if they haven't already to menti.com and to enter the code that is displayed here, which is 2291-2284. And go ahead and enter your questions on the screen that will be displayed, and we'll now turn over to Menti and see what questions we have gotten from the audience. And I'll mute, and it's back to you.
Okay. Let's just see. In Southwest Florida, what is the current rate of sea level rise? If I go back to my slides, and you don't have to, because I can do it. I've got it up on my on my desktop here, just to see where we were. Down in the Keys, and it's a little bit different. I didn't include going up the coast towards Tampa, but the rate right now is about 3.91 millimeters per year, which is about 0.15 inches a year. Okay, which kind of equates to about, we've seen about 1.2 feet in the last 100 years, but that's based on a linear best fit. So if we're going to talk about increases with non-stationarity, then that rate could start going up. Is sea level rise going to continue to track with intermediate high projections, or is there a chance it will escalate? That is a great question. One of the things that's going to come out on the new, we're actually working on that right now. It's sort of an interagency group working on updating the projections. It'll come out as a NOAA technical report. There's going to be some new science, mostly led by NASA, looking at some basically extrapolations going back from 1970 and looking at the trends, and then extrapolating out to 2050 to see kind of where we might be headed. The intermediate is where it seems like where we are now, but there is a chance. And again, the key is it's not going to be a smooth line like the curves are. They're going to go up and down, and sometimes there's decadal things going on. On the east coast of Florida, there's issues with the Gulf Stream slowing causes there to be changes and then on the Western Gulf Shelf, we're seeing some kind of interesting information in the data. There might be something going on there too. So this is why we try to tell folks to plan for multiple scenarios based on your risk tolerance. Don't pick one number. With increased precipitation, how will our groundwater tables be affected? Great question. It's probably most important, especially in the southern Florida with the limestone substrate there, where the fresh water is sitting on top of the salt water sort of as a lens. And as you increase the saltwater intrusion, the fresh water will sit on that and rise as well. So you'll have more areas exposed to the groundwater table being at the surface. So it'll be even harder to get places to dry. South Florida already has that problem. Essentially, the Everglades is where the water table is right at the surface. So, continued development in areas like that would require you to start to try to drain and somehow pump and drain that off. But that's going to continue to be an issue. Not to mention the deeper water wells. Deeper well for drinking water when start being infiltrated by salt water too. Let's see here. Some coastal cities are continuing to invest in infrastructure such as weirs. In addition to the impact it will have on wildlife, looks like that will not be effective against sea level rise plus increased precipitation. Yes, I'm reminded of places like Broward and in Miami where there's a canal system and there's a set of flood control structures. It's not just in Miami, they're all over the country. And yeah, that seems to be where sea level rise will, because they weren't designed to handle long, elevated water levels coming in from the ocean. That's going to be a challenge. And then I think what we've seen is it's going to require communities to do a little bit more sophisticated modeling, maybe like two-dimensional modeling that includes precip coming in on sort of a gridded precip, in addition to connecting to, let's say, a time series of tide of water level information. So you get the impacts or the backwater from the tide and all that. So it's probably going to require a little more sophisticated modeling, which requires a little higher resolution and accuracy data. Very flat places like Florida need to have very accurate, high accuracy elevation data, because it all kind of happens within the first 1 or 2 feet. So it's critical to get that taken into account. If it all depends on emissions, what is NOAA doing to stop use of fossil fuels? Well, I won't comment on that one. NOAA is not the agency that does any regulations as far as that goes. Will the ocean circulation belt be affected due to all the rising temperatures? There has been evidence that that's the case. I am not an oceanographer, but I know that the conveyor belt, where the warm water is translated down into the southern poles, or to the poles where it enhances, upwelling and things like that, and that slowing down can cause major climatic impacts. Certainly, that's something that goes into the global climate models when they look at that. Let's see. What are the best, most understandable tools to share this local info with elective board? That's a great question. We have tried to make several tools available. We have something called a Coastal County Snapshot. Didn't get to go into that, but you can Google it, Coastal County Snapshot. And we're actually working on a sea level rise snapshot now that'll incorporate the latest science out of the new NOAA Tech report when it does come out. That's a great way to kind of communicate what the issue is to elected officials. It keeps it kind of at the higher level. So you can look into that. Let's see. What are some of the best resiliency methods for coastal communities you have seen? I didn't get a chance to go into one of the, if you look at the Southeast or any of the National Climate Assessment, NCA4, there was really an emphasis on the last climate assessment to show examples and not just say, hey, this is a problem, but like, what are we doing about it? You see examples in there like this community in Louisiana, Jean Lafitte, that's trying to move the entire community. Relocation, they've been looking at places in Alaska that have coastal erosions with like Kivalina, trying to relocate. The Corps of Engineers has done a feasibility study there. That's on the more extreme side. You see communities like here in Charleston, South Carolina, where they have invested in a lot of money into improving the drainage system, the stormwater system, digging down 140 feet and building a large tunnel to receive all the rainwater and then pumping it out, installing new pumps similar to what New Orleans is doing. The Corps of Engineers was doing a seawall feasibility study here in Charleston. You've seen other feasibility studies like up in New York for this large storm surge barrier. So there are a lot of different, I guess, options on the table that's being looked at, adaptation planning. And I guess what it comes down to is, it's the cost benefit equation. Does it warrant putting that much money into something to save a certain amount of things? And unfortunately, as I mentioned, that's all really based on kind of like infrastructure and the built environment, not on other things such as, aesthetics and kind of the reason people come to the coast, the tourism component. Yeah, we can save our city, but if we have nothing there for them to look at that has any appreciable value in terms of aesthetics, then how does that impact the cost benefit equation? So that kind of thing. Let's see here. Hi, Doug. I live in Big Pine Key. Would it be a bad idea for me to buy a house there? will I be underwater in the next 10 or 20 years? Well, I'll tell you, I don't know exactly where that is, but I can point you to, we have it's called a sea level rise viewer. If you just Google NOAA sea level rise viewer, you can type in your location and it'll let you look at different levels of water levels above today's like mean high water, which is kind of the average high tides, and get an idea for how vulnerable. In many cases, it's you may not flood in 10-20 years, but the island may be cut off during storm events, and therefore you can't access it, that kind of thing. So I know a lot of places like hospitals are starting to look at, we need to relocate because we can't get emergency services here to our hospital during flooding events. That's actually happening here in Charleston right now. So yet another thing that changes the benefit equation when the hospitals start to move out.
Yes, certainly. Thank you so much, Doug, for that. And very much appreciate your excellent presentation. We're going to now go on to the next presenter. It will be Dr. Michael Savarese presenting on assessing flooding vulnerability due to sea level rise in Collier County using a Coon. Next slide. Dr. Savarese is a professor of coastal resilience and climate adaptation within the Department of Marine and Earth Sciences at the Florida Gulf Coast University's Water School. His teaching and research interests concern the history of environmental change in coastal settings, particularly in response to human development, climate change, and sea level rise. Dr. Savarese.
Thanks, Jennifer. Hi, everybody. Everybody can hear me okay? Thumbs up from somebody? Okay, thanks, Jennifer. Anyway, good afternoon. Glad to be with you all. Doug, great presentation. Before I start, I just thought one of the questions that was asked of Doug inquired about the rates of sea level rise here in Southwest Florida. And maybe it was Jennifer who put in the information from the subaquatic vegetation monitoring in Charlotte Harbor. But if you look at NOAA's tide gauge for Naples, the pattern that you see there is pretty much the same that Doug had mentioned, following that quadratic, the fact that sea level rise rates are accelerating. So between 1965 and about 2000, it's about a 3 millimeter per year rise. And then from 2000 to 2021, it's about a 7.3 millimeter per year rise. So we're seeing that same pattern that Doug had mentioned. So there's consistency here in South Florida. So anyway, so let me get to the matter at hand. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about today about how a community can get together and look at its vulnerability. Doug had mentioned NOAA's process for climate change preparedness. One of those steps in that process is doing a vulnerability analysis and understanding where you're vulnerable. There's a lot going on in Southwest Florida. I live in Collier County, and Collier County has been very receptive to vulnerability analysis and adaptation planning. So I want to talk to you a little bit about what's happening there in Collier. I specifically want to talk about a tool package that is the acronym Coon. I'll explain what that is in a little bit. But a lot of what I'm going to talk about in Collier County is about to expand to the other two counties in Southwest Florida, Charlotte and Lee. So Jennifer, if you could advance me one. Thanks. I wasn't quite sure if there was going to be good background in terms of the science of climate change, and Doug did a spectacular job. So I think I'm just going to breeze through these just to save time. You've probably all seen this graph before. Doug didn't talk specifically about how average temperature has gone up over time. But what you see here is anomalously hot in red and anomalously cold in blue years since 1880. And it's basically the averages, the year's average temperature compared to a running average from 1880 at about the time of industrialization up to the present. And you can see since about 1980 to the present, we've had years that are hotter than average. And you can see those peaks as we get closer to 2020 get higher and higher. We've had the hottest 5 or 6 years or so in recorded history. And if you notice there along the y-axis, those red peaks top out at about 1 degree centigrade above average. The AR6 IPCC report talks about us having reached the 1.1 degree centigrade rise. And of course, we're trying to manage the planet and keep us under 1.5 degrees centigrade, which AR6 now has us achieving without hope of slowing that up sometime in the 2030s. So the temperature is going up, and we're essentially going to have to deal with at least a 1.5 degrees centigrade warmer world as we prepare as coastal communities. The next slide shows essentially the same graph that Doug showed. You can see in blue, in the blue curve there is a tracking of carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. And you can see just off the top of the graph for 2020, we're already at 412 parts per million in terms of carbon dioxide greenhouse gas concentrations. And you can also see here is temperature. And you can see temperature in red, CO2 and blue are tracking each other remarkably. And there are lots of warm periods and cold periods long before humans were driving cars and burning fossil fuels. But the most compelling and worrisome is the last 100 years, that last little centimeter or so on the rightmost portion of the x-axis, where CO2 levels have just skyrocketed. And temperature, you can see, hasn't had a chance to respond quite yet. So it really is a worrisome problem. Next slide. This is DEP's version of NOAA's process for climate change preparedness. It's just contextualized in a slightly different way. So this is DEP's roadmap for being prepared. And you can see there are 4 steps on this roadmap. Context is really about getting the community together, understanding what the problem is, deciding what its purpose and goals are going to be. Vulnerability, stop 2 on the road, is basically understanding what you're vulnerable to, when and where as we move forward into the future. That then drives your car to step 3, adaptation strategies, where you're basically developing plans to lessen your vulnerability and improve your resilience. And then the last step on here are the implementation strategies. Essentially, what kinds of practices and policies are you going to implement? Now, oddly enough, what's missing from this roadmap, I would argue, is stop 5. And stop 5 is a stop that deals with carbon mitigation. In other words, how do we, even at a local community basis, what it can do to reduce its carbon footprint? And I think it's helpful if communities think beyond just accepting what nature throws our way and having us just think about adaptation, but thinking about reducing the most horrific potential outcomes of climate change. The next slide shows a couple of graphs that Doug also showed from the 4th National Climate Assessment Report in 2018. And the details don't really matter here, but you can see on the left are how warm the planet might get. Is it going to be 1 degree centigrade warmer, or 4.5 or 5 degrees centigrade warmer? Down on the right there, will sea level rise a meter? Will it rise 2.4 meters? And a lot of that has to do with how we manage our carbon footprint. You can see the red lines here. I've positioned the red lines at roughly 2060. And I would argue that given at least current carbon use practices, maybe we are able to adapt to the changes that come our way till 2060. And after 2060, adaptation, at least in a general sense, becomes unsustainable. So really, climate preparedness really requires, I guess I would argue or advocate 2 things: doing the adaptation planning for the more immediate kinds of problems the next 50 years or so, and then working diligently to reducing our carbon footprint so that we don't appreciate the worst outcomes. And again, if you followed COP26 in Scotland, the drive is really to become carbon neutral by 2050 and hit our nationally defined targets by 2030 to prevent us from exceeding the 1.5 degrees centigrade rise. So next slide. All right, so let me talk about what's happening in Collier County. How is it dealing with its vulnerability and adaptation planning? Collier's been kind of blessed by 2 NOAA funded projects. Thank you, Doug. Thank you to your agency for funding these 2 projects. The one on top, their first bullet item, is the one I'm going to talk about, a Coon adaptation of coastal, urban, and natural ecosystems. And it's essentially a package of vulnerability tools that deal with the flooding caused by sea level rise, nuisance flooding, and by storm surge on top of sea level rise. Those tools are now ready for Collier County, and the good news for the rest of Southwest Florida is we have funding now to extend that modeling work for the entire 3-county region. There's a companion project also funded by Noaa, which is called Coon Plus. It essentially is a separate package of vulnerability analysis tools, but doesn't deal with the seawater aspect, or rather the freshwater aspect, and it looks at precipitation and freshwater flooding in Collier County. And that'll be ready probably in another year, year and a half. And when that's done, Collier County will have a comprehensive package to look at its vulnerability to water. At the moment, a Coon Plus doesn't have the funding to extend beyond Collier County, but we're hoping to make that happen. Now, I should say, I'm not the oceanographer, the modeler. I'm more like the regional liaison that's helping locally and working with local governments. The brains and the brawn really come from professionals at the University of Florida, the U.S. Geological Survey, here as well at Florida Gulf Coast University. The South Florida Water Management District and a company called Flow2D have been involved as well, at least in a Coon Plus. So I won't talk about a Coon Plus. And then at the very end, if there's time, and if I don't exhaust the clock, I'll also talk a little bit about another effort that Collier's involved in, but involves the entire region, and that's the establishment of the Southwest Florida Regional Resiliency Compact. Next slide. We're all here in Southwest Florida. I don't think I need to review this. Collier County is really no different in terms of its climate-related problems than the other counties in our region. You know, we're this weird blend of urban and public lands, suburban and public lands. We have a lot of small cities. Most of us are coastal, but we're not exclusively coastal. We have inland communities. The drivers that seem to be most important are sea level rise and storminess, but there's lots of other problems or drivers that don't seem to garner as much attention, like heat, particularly for people that are, working outside, particularly in the interior communities, and fire. We have our issues with wildfires as well. There's a lot of valued natural and cultural resources across our landscape. The nice thing about the work that I'm going to share with you in a minute is that it considers not just urban resources, but cultural and natural resources as well. And there's a strong drive to improve resilience, specifically in regard to sea level rise, storm surge, and fresh water flooding. But again, I would urge the region to think about heat as well. Next slide. The nice thing about this work in Collier with a Coon and a Coon Plus is that it's really reached out and engaged the entire community. And it's engaged the grassroots folks, the grass tops folks, as well as decision makers and elected officials in government. And that's happened from the very beginning. So the community was intimately involved, beginning with the writing of the proposal through its implementation. The work was also endorsed by the Board of County Commissioners, and we have three jurisdictions, three cities, incorporated cities in Collier, and their city councils were supportive. The project developed two teams, an urban resilience and planning team, and then a natural and cultural resources management team with about 70 or so members in total. And these are the professionals that are making decisions about adaptation planning and resilience. There were countless public presentations and workshops. We also engaged, I mentioned the grass tops. We recruited about 80 civic leaders throughout Collier County. These are the big names and movers and shakers within various social and economic sectors of the county. And I got to tell you, what made this project most effective was engaging non-for-profits, NGOs, and most notably, the League of Women Voters, the Collier County chapter. Their help has been invaluable in getting people involved and getting the word out. Next slide. You've seen these curves in Doug's presentation. So the graph that you see on the lower right basically shows you the Noaa curves defined in 2017, and you can see the low, the intermediate, low, intermediate, and so on graphs. All of those numbered dots you can see along the top 13.8, 40.6, 100.4. Those defined the scenarios that the Coon mapping tool employed. And then the table that you can see on the left has 3 target dates, 2030, 2060, 2100. And then you can see the 3 sea level rise magnitudes that were modeled in feet. So anywhere in 2030 of about 0.4 feet of sea level rise. This is relative to the year 2000, by the way, to as much as 8.4 feet in 2100. And so it gives decision makers sort of a glimpse of each of those 9 scenarios in that 3x3 matrix you can see. Next slide. What's in a Coon? It is a package of tools. It's not just one tool. And I got to tell you, it's probably the most sophisticated and robust package I've seen. The backbone of it is founded on something known as a CH3D SWAN modeling effort, which deals with sea level rise, waves, and surge, and can be run with and without the influence of storms. It also engages FEMA's HAZUS economic tool, so you can actually look at the property loss associated with different scenarios annualized as you move forward into the future. There's also a rapid forecasting tool, which is now actually being used by Collier Emergency Management, which allows the emergency management people to manipulate storms before they impact the coast to develop additional contingency planning possibilities, which is kind of interesting. And this last piece looks at XBeach is the modeling effort, and it predicts how the coast is likely to respond geomorphologically due to storms and sea level rise. So you can see how the topography and the landscape of the coast is going to change over time. In addition, there was great effort, again, working with local community people to develop layers of assets. An asset is something of value. It might be a church, it might be a Calusa Native American mound, it might be roadways. And in essence, those assets were collected, mapped, and then can be overlain on top of a Coon, so you can actually see which assets are impacted as you move forward into the future. Next slide. So let me just show you some still glimpses of a Coon. So this is what the web viewer looks like. So you can run this on any web browser. You're just looking at a Google Earth image with nothing turned on. You can see there's in the upper right, I believe that is, you can see a legend where you can turn on different assets and you can turn on different tools. The next slide shows you a couple of the asset layers turned on. So here you're seeing the location of fire stations and parks. And so you can turn these on and off as you best see fit, depending on what you're interested in reviewing. The next slide shows, I think, the same image with the same assets. You could move forward one, please. Did I lose everybody? Am I talking to no one? I hope I'm not out there alone in the ethos. Okay. Can you get the slide to move forward? It's the problem with these kinds of presentations. Sometimes you can talk, and 20 minutes later, you find out you've been disconnected. Yeah, for some reason, it's not changing.
All right.
Jennifer,
So
you don't look panicked.
I'm not panicked. I have a whole team behind us, but I think
there you go.
I do think we lost connection here. So I'm gonna have to see what we can do to bring up an alternate. Sophia, do you have the backup?
I have
You
the
want
backup.
to share my screen?
I can
No.
share mine. Nicole should be hopping on in just 1 second. Let me get to your slides.
My slides are open. If you just want to pass the sharing honor to me, I can just use mine to save time.
I've definitely got yours pulled up.
There we go.
There we go.
Yeah, there we go. All right. So if you can just hit slideshow. Well done. Nice, nice pulling it off. I would normally panic and we'd be in dire straits if it were up to me. Anyway, so this is the viewer now with a couple of the tools turned on, so you can still see the distribution of fire stations and parks. And what's actually viewed here, or what's mapped here, is both nuisance flooding and storm surge. So this is 2060 under what is a medium sea level rise magnitude. And this is assuming the 1 in 100 year storm impacted the landscape at this time. And this viewer is the mapping is very high resolution. I think it's a 20 by 20 meter pixel. So you can zoom right into the landscape and see what's going on. Okay, next slide. All right, so I thought I would just show you 3 examples of how a Coon is actually being used at this particular juncture in time to help with understanding vulnerability. And I'll show you kind of a bigger scale kind of a problem, one dealing with the city of Naples, and they're dealing with their problems they're having with their stormwater management infrastructure. We'll focus in on a non-for-profit, Naples Botanical Garden, and how they're using Coon to revise their management plan, and then talk a little bit about how the Florida Public Archaeological Network, FPAN, is using this and bringing cultural resource managers together to prioritize and make decisions about how to manage the incredibly numerous cultural assets that sit on the Collier landscape. The next slide should show you the Coon viewer again. So we're zoomed in to downtown Naples. So this is where you would go if you had lots of money and wanted to eat or buy expensive artwork, or if you wanted to, hop on a Lear jet and fly out of Naples. You can see the airport here. And what you're seeing is nuisance flooding. So this is sunny day flooding for 2030 under the medium sea level rise magnitude. That's a 0.7 foot rise in the future. And you can see this image, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 red outline. They're polygons, red polygons that are assets mapped by the city of Naples. And these are the city's critical stormwater assessment areas that are having serious engineering problems with their stormwater management. And the city is about to issue a large contract to an engineering firm to battle the needs for stormwater management. And what they're doing is they're using a Coon to inform that engineering firm as to what the likely problems are going to be in the future. You can see if you look at drainage basin number 3, I wish I could point it to you. Yeah, that'll work. Perfect. Thank you. And you can see the blue colors. If you look at the scale bar on the left, you can see blue represents a 1 foot sea level rise. The lighter greens are as much as an 8 foot sea level rise. So that's telling you what the inundation depth is of standing water due to nuisance flooding in 2030 if sea level goes up 0.7 feet. Okay, and you can see drainage basin 3, which is part of the core of the city of Naples, has some serious nuisance flooding issues it has to deal with. So it's helping adaptationally plan stormwater infrastructure engineering improvements. The next slide takes you to Naples Botanical Garden. If you've not been there, make a trip. It's a marvelous place. One of the remarkable things there's a lot of remarkable things about the garden, but one of them is their efforts to basically conserve Caribbean endangered plants with a seed bank, and by cultivating those plants right on their property. So they're collecting and planting endangered Caribbean plant species on their property. Is their property resilient enough to handle where it is they're planning on these banked gardens? The next slide shows you the Coon viewer again. Here you can see Naples Botanical Garden. Again, this is for 2030 under a low sea level rise value. So this is about as low as you can go in 2030 of a 0.4 foot rise. And you can see here, there's lots of dark blues and light blues. There are large portions of the Naples Botanical Garden property that are going to be inundated due to nuisance flooding with some frequency in 2030. And this is being used to help guide exactly where they're going to manage these collections. The last slide, or the next slide, it's not the last, but it's almost the last. I don't have any gee whiz Coon views for you. I just thought I would quickly talk through this. Oftentimes vulnerability analyses ignore or don't consider thoroughly cultural resources. this is something that the Coon effort has done remarkably well. And we've brought together a great collection of cultural resource managers, and they've just completed a very thorough a vulnerability report that's in its final draft stage to help local government and different agencies that are managing these cultural resource properties deal with the problems that are coming away. So here you can see our two, that picture on the left is nuisance flooding on a Calusa shell mound in Collier County. And then many of you probably know of the Smallwood store in Chokoloskee, historic resource that is much cherished and at great risk. Okay, the next slide. Jennifer, it's 2 o'clock. I've lost track of time. Do you want me to wrap this up, or do I have just a couple minutes to talk about the compact?
Yeah, if you could wrap it up in the next couple minutes, that'd be great.
All right. I think all I need to say is that there's a compact to come in. You're probably all familiar with compacts and coalitions where local jurisdictions have teamed up to create alliances. The next slide, I believe, shows a map of where existing and incipient compacts sit on the Florida landscape. And Charlotte, Lee, and Collier have come together with a signed MOU. And we are now officially an entity. And we had our first organizational meeting a few weeks ago. And I'm hoping that by December, we'll have our governance structure and a design. And so that's great news. And you can see there are a lot of, most of the coastal counties have already teamed up. You're probably familiar with the Southeast Compact. Jennifer Jurado is going to be talking a little bit about Broward's perspectives and their involvement in the Southeast Compact. But these are good things. And given the new legislation, the Resilient Florida Act, which was a signed law after Senate Bill 1954, there is motivation for forming alliances, and there's money now coming through the state to deal with resilience. There always has been, but there's a whole lot more money coming in now. The next slide, just skip it. We can just call it quits. I'll just say thank you. And again, there are a lot of contributors to this. I really need to acknowledge my colleagues at University of Florida, USGS in particular. I give the presentations and they do the hard work. And the Collier League has been remarkable. And thanks to Noaa and the governments having them engaged and fully supportive has been wonderful. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Savarese. If everyone now wouldn't mind going on to minty.com, if they don't have it open already, here's the code that you'll want to enter, 2291-2284, and then go ahead and submit your questions. Next slide. We'll take just a minute to pull this up, and here are some questions already coming in for you.
Okay, I'm looking at the shortest sentence first. Is a Coon available online for public use? It's not at the moment, but it will be. Our issue there is that when the tools are still being developed or refined, the University of Florida considers that active research, and they don't want active research to be available to the public. And so where a Coon has been released and to local decision makers, so the work has been moving forward. The expectation is that within the next 6 months or so, it will be available online to the public. We've also developed some really great manuals and user familiarity tools, helpful videos, and a manual that can help. What can the compact do that the counties couldn't already have done? Yeah, so that's a great question. And that's actually a question that some of the compact jurisdictions have asked as well. Maybe Jennifer Jurado later on can talk about the value of the compact. I work here, I'm sitting in my office, and I'm in the village of Estero, okay? And Estero has, 6 employees. There's really not much they can do on their own. Admittedly, they sit in Lee County, but it's up to Lee County then to look after their climate change preparedness. There really isn't any local government that has all the resources at its disposal to deal with such a complex and remarkably expensive problem. And so there's great value in teaming up. And why do things independently at twice the cost when you might be able to cooperate and do things more cheaply and share resources? There's also great anecdotal evidence anyway to suggest that alliances improve fundability. And I think it's too early to tell, but the new grant program may demonstrate that. So I think the nice thing about the compact, the way we are designing it, is that no one jurisdiction's autonomy will ever be overrun. So every jurisdiction has the ability to do what it wants independently. There is no decision-making authority that comes with the compact. And that's pretty much the same for coalitions and compacts around the state. It says, when you say we won't be able to adapt to climate extremes, do you mean extremes in temperature or potential future unsustainable extremes that would happen if we do not go carbon neutral? I guess what I'm saying there is that, given our existing lifestyle, our existing economies, our existing geographic distribution, adaptation is really about keeping those economies, those social structures sustainable in place. And if there is an 8-foot rise in sea level, obviously that's not something that can be adapted to in place and not sustainable. And that's going to require major pattern shifts in the way we as society interact with our landscape. And so I guess what I try to do, it seems like there's greater receptiveness with local governments and with the general public to talk about adapting to change that's coming, and less receptiveness to mitigating carbon and avoiding the worst case scenarios. And I think given the urgency of minimizing our chances for realizing the worst case scenarios, it's important now not only to be adaptively planning for what's coming our way, but to try to minimize what the extremes are that we might have to adapt to. So what else do I have here? What was the threshold used to define flooding? I might have missed it. A Coon, I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but what defines flooding? Flooding is when there's water, in this case seawater, either due to extreme high tides or due to storm surge or waves on top of a higher sea level in the future. It's defined by the elevation of the landscape. Any modeling effort that looks at flooding depends intimately on how good your topography is, how well represented your topography is. And the process there involves something known as LiDAR data and the building of a digital elevation model. And one of the things that Coon has done, it's recruited some of the best and the brightest folks out of the US Geological Survey to ensure that we've got very accurate digital elevation models. So then the threshold is how high is the ground and where does that water move along the landscape? And if the water moves along the landscape and sits above the surface elevation, then that area is flooded. So are we running out of time, Jennifer?
We are, but thank you so much for answering all of those great questions. And we will have information available online after this event at chnep.org for people to be able to see the bios and the contact information of the presenters to reach out to them if they have further questions. So at this time, thank you so much. We're going to take a 5-minute break. Please return by 2:15 when we'll start again promptly then. And in the meantime, we'll just go ahead and turn all of the videos off. Thank you. All right, if everyone wouldn't mind returning to their computers from the bio break, we're going to be resuming here in just 1 minute. Welcome back, everyone. Our next presentation is the use of engineering with nature strategies and natural infrastructure as techniques for reducing flood risk by Dr. Jeffrey King. Next slide, please. Dr. King is the program manager and deputy national lead for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Engineering with Nature program. His current projects and research interests include incorporation of EWN techniques and designs into traditional infrastructure, design and application of natural and nature-based features, promoting landscape architecture concepts and practices in pursuit of nature-based solutions, and fostering collaborative partnerships to achieve innovative outcomes that are aligned with the elements of the EWN Engineering with Nature initiative. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. King.
Thank you, Jennifer. Can I get a mic check?
We can hear you loud and clear.
Wonderful. Great. Thank you. And thank you for the invitation to be with you all today. I was very excited to join this program, and thank you to Doug and Michael for those two great presentations. That was fantastic information to have, and certainly we'll take that back with me. Next slide, please. So today I wanted to offer some additional insight into the Corps' Engineering with Nature program. And we define the program as this intentional alignment of natural and engineering processes to not only achieve a desired engineering outcome, but do it in a way that we also achieve economic, environmental, and social benefits. And we do all of this through collaboration and partnership. And with the Engineering with Nature program, it's actually been around for about 10 years. It started out as an initiative. And then in 2020, Congress formally made it a program within the Corps. And our program is centered around research and development, advancing practice in the pursuit of innovative strategies focused on natural infrastructure, nature-based solutions. And so that R&D includes laboratory and field work. It also advances different types of models and tools so that we can become better informed in terms of the approach to natural infrastructure, the performance of natural infrastructure, and also determining where natural infrastructure best fits in different systems. And so with this program, we support all of the different Corps districts. We also support the Department of Defense and also different communities across the U.S. and also internationally. I mentioned that with our program, there is a tremendous amount of collaboration and partnership that occurs. That includes the private sector, non-governmental organizations, academics, and other federal and state agencies. You see the four key elements of engineering with nature listed here on the left. Many of those are intuitive, but just really to maybe emphasize some of the thoughts here that will come up. One of the bigger ones is this idea of natural processes, using natural processes to the maximum extent that you can. And this is really thinking about nature and all of the wonderful dynamic processes that exist in nature, and the idea that we can actually leverage what Mother Nature is already doing to create more resilience in our coastal systems as well as our inland systems. And an idea there might be that, for example, with river systems and sediments that are generated, we dredge a lot of sediment within the Corps of Engineers, in fact, 200 million cubic yards annually. And so are there ways that we can strategically place that material in river systems or in coastal communities or coastal environments where perhaps we can create islands and use those islands as ways to create more resilience and even through that process, also create the environmental and social benefits that we also want to see happen. We maintain a website, and hopefully some of you have already visited that website. A lot of the information that I present today will be on that website, so I would encourage you to check that out. Next slide, please. I mentioned partnership and how important that is, and this is an example of what we've strived to do here recently in the way of developing an even stronger way of networking across various organizations. And so what you see here is the Network for Engineering with Nature, and it has its own independent website that you also see listed. The bullets represent many of the high priority areas that the network is focusing on. It started back in the fall of 2020 with the University of Georgia and the Corps of Engineers initially standing up the network. And since that time, we've added 8 additional organizations to the network. And it's really wonderful to see so many people interested in engineering with nature and wanting to engage. And through this really focused network, we're able to harness all the expertise and skill sets and research interest across these organizations to really bring even additional resources and knowledge to many of these different challenges that we currently face. And in addition to research and these opportunities to be able to convey information more quickly and efficiently, we also are striving to train the next generation of engineers and scientists. And you see several academic institutions listed here that have joined the network, including the University of Florida. And so through this engagement with academic institutions, we're going to be offering courses. We'll also be looking at continuing education opportunities, as well as certifications focused on engineering with nature and natural infrastructure. So very excited to see where that's going and continuing to get more interest from other parties that would like to join. Next slide, please. I mentioned the need to communicate. And so with our program, we really want to be able to reach a broad audience and be able to offer people, organizations, as much information as possible focused on engineering with nature and nature-based solutions and strategies to create resilience. And so there's several different products that we have put out for the public. And on the far left, you see our Engineering with Nature Atlas series being represented. The first 2 books, Volume 1 and Volume 2, are focused on different engineering with nature projects that have been developed across the U.S. as well as internationally. And there's many examples of what we would call natural nature-based features listed there, projects that are natural infrastructure in design, but really focused on flood risk reduction. And then that third book is really focused on what we're doing in support of Department of Defense, and it highlights 8 different installations where engineering with nature has been applied successfully. So those books are offered on our website, and you can actually go there and leaf through an electronic copy of those different books. And if you're interested, you want a hard copy to be able to have to highlight in your office or with different stakeholders that you work with, we're happy to send out hard copies of those books. You can go to our website and contact us, and we would be happy to send those to you. We also offer other means of communicating to the public, certainly through our website and the information that we offer there. We've also started a series of podcasts. We're now moving towards season 3 with our podcast, and the podcasts really focus on bringing different subject matter experts to the table to talk more about the different work that is ongoing, that they're familiar with, or that they're leading, and really offers the audience a really good perspective, a deep dive, if you will, on various topics related to engineering with nature. And then in terms of communication, we're also working to make sure that even Congress is aware of what it is we're doing. And so that picture on the far right is Todd Bridges, who is our national lead for engineering with nature, testifying on the Hill to the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works. Next slide, please. And I mentioned season 3 of our Engineering with Nature podcast. And again, all of these are on our website. And I hope that you'll take some time and listen to some of our different episodes. And I just wanted to highlight, for example, 4 of the episodes that we currently have in season 3. Episode 5 should be posted today. And that episode features some of my colleagues from the National Park Service as well as U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And they're talking about the different strategies that they're developing and implementing at their various properties to combat climate change and hopefully preserve many of the different resources that they maintain and are responsible for. Next slide, please. I also wanted to offer a snapshot of some of the different active R&D projects that we have within our portfolio. And this is a listing of about 11 of our current projects. And if you're interested in learning more about any of these projects, we have these on our website and their current status and their fact sheets are also offered there. And where applicable, our principal investigators have included additional information and updates that you may find interesting. One of the projects that I'll just sort of raise right now is this idea of maximizing the long-term function of coastal islands. And this is a really interesting project that is focused on understanding the performance of coastal islands. And if we really stop to think about it, and I think Doug and Michael offered an excellent perspective of sort of where we're headed in the future, we really got to be thinking sort of out of the box in terms of what will be the tools in the toolbox for achieving the resilience that we need. And so the idea of ecosystem restoration is incredibly important. It absolutely is. But then in terms of resilience and what is needed, we might want to be thinking much, much bigger. And so this idea of either going in and restoring or creating islands for the purpose of wave reduction and storm risk reduction, that becomes incredibly important. And so we really need to understand and quantify the performance of these island systems. And through these kinds of research projects and being able to quantify the benefits derived from these types of features, we'll be able to better design projects and be able to understand more in terms of how they fit into the landscape and how we can really achieve the desired outcomes to help us minimize risk in the future. So that's one example of the projects. And you can see here on the right the different pictures that are offered that highlight number 6, which is better understanding and quantifying benefits derived from the mangroves. And so you can see the top is a mangrove forest that's located in Florida. And again, there's field measurements and work that we do very closely with our colleagues to better understand the performance of these mangrove forests. But then we also want to get at some of the more difficult kinds of analysis. And you can see a flume highlighted there in the bottom picture where you see a replica of the root system for a mangrove. And then there's dozens of sensors embedded within each of those different roots. And then waves are moved and propagated through that flume so that we can understand the dampening that mangrove roots can provide. And through that quantifying of benefits relative to different wave intensities, we can start to really get at some of these critical performance indicators that feed into how we would go about designing future mangrove systems for the purpose of reducing risk and increasing resilience. And then with number 1, that's where I'm going to focus a little bit more of my time today is a recent product that we have out there that's focused on flood risk reduction using natural nature-based features. Next slide, please. So this is a product that was 5 years in the making. It's our international guidelines on use of natural nature-based features. And we published this in September of 2021. Again, if you're interested in taking a look at this, it is on our website. The document in its entirety is about 1,000 pages. So it's a beast of a document. But it offers a lot of really good and interesting information for practitioners. And you can see the different chapters that are highlighted on the left. We have a focus on coastal systems, but then we also spend time focused on riverine and fluvial systems towards the end of the guidelines document. With this project, I mentioned it was 5 years in the making. It brought together a little over 150 authors and contributors from 70 different organizations around the world to develop this. And it was a really wonderful opportunity to bring together very talented individuals that had experience in this space to really capture best available information and insight and bring it into one document that could be made available to the public. And so we do have this 1,000-page document that is available for download, or you can look at it electronically. We also created kind of a Reader's Digest version, an executive summary, if you will, that highlights key messages and key points from each of these chapters. And that too is identified as the overview, which is about 150 pages, and it is also on our site as well. And this is another book that if you contact us, we will add you to the list of individuals that are requesting hard copies. And we'll get that out in the mail to you. So next slide, please. So with this being such a large document, there's going to be different parts of it that appeal to different people. And it could be quite challenging to really try to unpack all of this. And so what I wanted to do is use this time to sort of steer people in a direction that I think might be helpful when it comes to processing and digesting all of this information. And so when you go to the site, what you can find is a page identified as Exploring the Guidelines, which has all 20 chapters broken out. And so when you click on this page, you can go to a chapter of interest and actually click on that particular chapter to do a deeper dive and learn more about what's happening specific to the information in that chapter. Next slide. And this gives you an example of what you would find if, for example, you click on the community engagement chapter. And so once you get here, we've included an option that allows you to actually listen to a narration of highlights provided by the chapter lead, the individual that was the primary participant in bringing together all the information for that particular chapter. So for example, Maria Dillard with the National Institute of Standards and Technology was the lead for this community engagement chapter, and she's recorded a short presentation that you can listen to and sort of get the highlights of this chapter. And if it's compelling, you want to learn more about it, on the left side of this screen, you can see where you can actually get back to the ebook and be in a position to land on the community engagement chapter to do a deep dive and gain more information and insight. Next slide, please. So as I referenced, it's a lot of information, and here are some of my thoughts in terms of how to approach this for those interested in understanding how natural nature-based features can be leveraged to reduce flood risk. My first thought here would be that if you take a moment and read the introduction, that's going to well position you to better understand sort of the high-level thoughts and concepts that are packed into this document. And there's a really nice illustration in there of a watershed. And within that illustration, the different chapters are highlighted relative to the features and where you would find them in a watershed. And I think it's a really interesting illustration, and it really becomes very meaningful for people that sort of need a sense of spatial orientation and where these different types of features might be positioned in the landscape. So that's a really good chapter to start with, obviously. I would also encourage you to read the overview version of the framework chapter. So that's the smaller Reader's Digest version of the framework chapter. And within that actual chapter in the overview, on page 14 and 15, you would find these two different figures. And here I would just say it really is helpful to go ahead and print these two figures out. One on the far left offers a highlight of the different steps that a practitioner would want to follow leading up to the deployment and construction of a natural nature-based feature. And there's a lot of good information in this figure that you can use. If you print it out, just put it to the side, go back and reference this as you're looking at the other chapters, as well as perhaps reading more in the framework chapter itself. And so the steps coupled with those high-level phases that you see on the right become incredibly important, and they also get referenced in future chapters that appear in the guidelines document. Next slide, please. So the next suggestion I would have is that really try to leverage some of the recorded presentations that we also have posted here. The idea here is with the high-level chapters, if you listen to those recorded presentations, it could be really helpful in determining what chapters you want to prioritize for really conducting that deep dive, and listen to the recorded presentation of the overview version of the chapter. That's really the way to go. And I would recommend that you do this for all of the high-level chapters. So that would be chapters 1 through chapter 7. So as you read one of these or listen to one of these, then I think you're better positioned to really capture more of the critical information that's actually in the text. And once you've completed the chapters 1 through 7, the high level ones, then you could move into the more specific chapters that are focused on, for example, coastal features like wetlands, beaches and dunes, submerged aquatic vegetation, created islands, and also with our fluvial chapters. And as you sort of unpack that, where you really gain more interest and enthusiasm for a specific topic, then move into the full-length chapters to really gain even more insight. And then finally, the other piece of this that I would offer is that listen to chapter 20, the future, that recorded message. It's a little bit longer message, but Todd Bridges offers some really great insight and perspective on why this kind of technology is important and why we need to be thinking differently as far as how we approach creating resilience. Conventional infrastructure and the same approach that we've been taking is going to be very, very problematic for many reasons. And so where we can, we should be thinking differently, and we really should be putting our best foot forward to bring nature into this equation and prioritizing nature-based solutions and natural infrastructure to help us achieve our desired outcomes. Next slide, please. And so where are we going with the guidelines now that we have them available to the public? Ideally, one of the things that we would like to do, because we are getting a lot of positive feedback from the public, and they're wanting to learn more, and they're wanting additional resources. So in addition to these overview kind of presentations that currently exist on our website. We'd like to come back and maybe populate that with what I would call a lecture style presentation, where we get our chapter leads to actually offer more insight and more information, and actually go through the chapters in their entirety to be able to have that additional insight made available through a presentation. So that's one of the things that we're currently working on, and we'll likely tee up in 2022. Given our current circumstances, virtual workshops are likely going to be the way that we best sort of engage different groups and communities and organizations. So we're likely going to be looking to hold virtual workshops here in the future that would focus on different priorities and thematic areas of interest in the guidelines, and so that will be something that we need to do. And then also, if situation improves, we'll be looking to leverage different conferences and workshops that are occurring in the U.S. and internationally to dovetail on those workshops and offer in-person training. Expert systems, that would be where we create a situation where people can ask questions online, interface with perhaps an avatar, and then be directed to the information that's offered there. And then there's also some really interesting ideas of creating games and tutorials that people can design natural infrastructure features and then see how it performs and responds in different systems. And so with that, we just go to the next slide. I'd like to just say thank you and appreciate the opportunity to answer any of your questions.
Well, thank you, Dr. King. And it's very exciting to see how that is taking root, the idea of nature-based engineering and solutions. We certainly ourselves work a lot with green and gray infrastructures and trying to blend those two wherever possible. If everyone now can log into Menti and put your questions in for Dr. King to answer, and we'll switch over to Menti now. And there's already a few for you to answer. Thank you.
Yeah, great. So with the first question, are there engineering with nature resources for those seeking funding to help implement large-scale projects? So that's a interesting question. And I would say that typically with the resources that we have, we don't use our funding for the purpose of constructing projects. However, in early phases of projects, we do bring our engineers and our social scientists and our landscape architects to the table with groups and work through some concepts and designs, and we can start that process of prioritizing what we think might be the right type of natural nature-based feature or nature-based solution for a system. So I would offer that at the very, very front end of the ideation and thinking through what might work and bringing the right people to the table, yes, that is something that we have done and will continue to do. And then we're really focused on the research and development, but construction is something that we don't typically have the resources to be able to complete. Is there a project example from Southwest Florida where the Army Corps of Engineers implemented engineering with nature in a project, and what nature-based features were added as a result? So there are some interesting examples, and what I would offer, because of time constraints here, is that the atlases, the engineering with nature atlases, highlight several different projects, not only from Florida, but around the country, that I think can really help to inform some of the ideas and concepts that people may want to pursue. So there's that thought. We also have some examples of islands from the east coast of Florida that are identified in the under the islands page on our Engineering with Nature site. And then also, just very quickly, MacDill Air Force Base, located near Tampa. They have some really great examples of use of reef balls and strategically placing reef balls in a way such that sediment was accumulated and actually accreted, and now there's wetland behind those reef balls. So that's another, I think, example of where you've seen Engineering with Nature really benefit some assets and resources. Thank you for the comment there about it being interesting. I really appreciate that. Is the Army Corps of Engineers building infrastructure? Is Army Corps of Engineers building infrastructure projects like the mangrove example into any specific projects right now, or is that just a mangrove wave attenuation study? Yeah, that's a great question, and unfortunately, I don't have knowledge of anything right now where that has taken place. Now, that could be in my blind spot. There is a lot of different natural infrastructure projects that are happening all over the U.S., and I've been focused a lot here recently on two large efforts in the Chesapeake Bay and then also in Alaska. So I really do need to sort of come back out of my very focused efforts and get that 360 high-level review again, and maybe talk to some of my colleagues down in Jacksonville District to better understand what might be happening there, as well as in the Caribbean. But it's a great question, and if somebody wants to maybe email me, I think my email might be available to the folks here on the call today. I'll be happy to check into that for you and get you more information.
Well, thank you very much again, Dr. King. And now we're going to be moving on to our next presenter. The next presentation is Reduce Disaster Suffering by David Marstad and Angie Neal, I believe as well, is going to be presenting with him. Mr. Marstad is FEMA's Deputy Associate Administrator for Insurance and Mitigation and the Senior Executive of the National Flood Insurance Program. His expertise in emergency management and strategic risk communication stems from substantial leadership roles in the private sector and local and state government as the former Nebraska mayor, senator, and lieutenant governor. We're very pleased to have you with us here today, David. If you'd like to go ahead, next slide, please.
Very good. Good afternoon. Jennifer, thank you for that kind introduction, for the opportunity to join the other great presentations. We're grateful to be a part of today's webinar with an update on where we are with the implementation of the NFIP's new pricing methodology, Risk Rating 2.0, Equity in Action. And thank you to all the attendees for your interest to learn more. And thank you to the Coastal and Heartland National Estuary Partnership for hosting today. I'm excited to say that on October 1st, the NFIP made history with Risk Rating 2.0 Equity in Action, our new rating system that is equitable, easy to understand, and designed to adapt to the increasing perils of climate change. The increasing severity, intensity, and frequency of disaster events that are accelerated by climate change demand that we take urgent action to reduce disaster suffering. And as the demand for housing and development continues across the state of Florida, we continue to believe that insurance coupled with mitigation is the first line of defense against the destructive impacts of flooding, and the best way for a property owner to protect the life they're building. I'll dive deeper into the new methodology and phased approach to implementation as I walk you through today's presentation, and then Andy Neal, the NFIP Chief Actuary, will dig into how these changes will affect Southwest Florida in particular. And then we'll be happy to take a few questions. Next slide. We've taken a phased approach to the implementation of the new pricing plan happening now, and that will continue into next year. Phase one kicked off with existing NFIP policyholders being able to take advantage of decreases on their policy renewal date. We also began selling new policies on October 1st. Under Risk Rating 2.0, new policyholders for any structure type located across a community will pay the full risk rate. Those premiums will no longer be subsidized or discounted under the NFIP. The significance of this is often overlooked. Phase 2 of the rollout will begin this coming April. I'll go into that more in a minute. First, I'd like to share some of the initial reactions we've seen to the rollout. As of November 28th, the NFIP sold more than 45,000 new policies since risk rating went into effect. In addition, more than 4,000 NFIP policyholders have renewed their coverage using Risk Rating 2.0. Under the new pricing methodology, 3,300 or 82% of those have seen a price drop when compared to their prior NFIP policy, with an average savings of greater than $1,700 per year. This has never happened before in the history of NFIP. That's more than $140 per month that our policyholders can use toward their mortgage payment, other insurance costs, or to pay for many other basic needs. For those seeing a price increase, the average in cost increase has been approximately $155 per year, or about $13 a month, which is on par with increases already occurring under the old methodology. We're confident that the trend towards an increase in new policies will continue because of the wide-ranging improvements we're making to the NFIP. We're expecting to have more insured properties, not fewer insured properties, as the years go by. We believe that Risk Rating 2.0 will help us close the insurance gap. Now, with Phase 2, beginning next April 1st, 2022, all remaining policies will be written under the new plan on their renewal date, continuing until March 31st of 2023. Now, this was a strategic decision made last March to allow these policyholders extra time to prepare, and for some of these policyholders, it's nearly 18 months from now before their policy is renewed based on Risk Rating 2.0 pricing. Next slide, please. Equity in Action has the capability and tools to incorporate flood risk variables like multiple flood frequencies beyond the 1% annual chance events, including river overflow, storm surge, coastal erosion, and heavy rainfall. We also look at a property's elevation, and an industry standard, the NFIP, is finally adopting the cost to rebuild. With improved technology, we can now help people understand a single property's flood risk profile. Vast improvement to the old approach that was limited to static measurements using the blunt instrument of a property's elevation within a zone on a flood insurance rate map. This is not just a minor improvement, but a generational, transformational leap forward. With Equity in Action, the NFIP is building on years of investment in flood hazard information by incorporating private sector data sets, catastrophe models, and evolving actuarial science. This includes using existing FEMA mapping data and NFIP policy and claims data, along with other federal government data from USGS, Noaa, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. In addition, third-party commercially available structural and replacement cost data, along with CAT flood models, are incorporated. It allows us to set actuarially sound rates and communicate flood risk more comprehensively than ever before, enabling FEMA to fulfill our obligation to clearly communicate flood risk. And risk is exactly what flood insurance pricing should be based on. Next slide. Risk rating 2.0 is transformational, but it's not changing every aspect of the NFIP. We are upholding statutory requirements by limiting annual premium increases to 18%. This will not change with risk rating 2.0. Also, the use of flood insurance rate maps for mandatory purchase and floodplain management remain unchanged. Premium discounts for pre-firmed, subsidized, and newly mapped properties will continue. Policyholders will still be able to transfer their rate discount to a new owner by assigning their flood insurance policy when property ownership changes. Discounts from 5 to 45% for policyholders in communities who participate in the community rating system, CRS, will continue. However, since risk rating 2.0 does not use flood zones to determine flood risk, the discount will be uniformly applied to all policies throughout the participating community, regardless of whether the structure is inside or outside of the special flood hazard area, which will lead to more policyholders receiving the discounted price. Next slide. One misconception is that under the old system, flood insurance rates weren't subject to regular annual increases. The truth is rates go up each year for all policyholders, 100%, and would continue to do so if no action is taken. Last year, overall NFIP premiums increased by 11.3% or $8 a month. These increases would similarly continue to occur year after year after year in an unjust manner, with low to moderate income policyholders paying more than they should and high income property owners paying less than their fair share. By leveling the playing field, equity in action premium rates will go down for roughly 1 million policyholders for the first time in NFIP's history. Under risk rating 2.0, 23% will see monthly decreases averaging $85 a month, whereas under the old system, policyholders just don't receive premium decreases. This can't be overlooked because it speaks to one of the tenets of equity in action, which is to reflect a property's unique flood risk accurately and fairly, and to price it accordingly. Under the new pricing methodology, 66% of policyholders, 2/3, will see a $0 up to $10 per month increase in their premiums. Overall, the impact on these policyholders is relatively neutral in year one. Another 7% will see an average of $10 to up to $20 a month increase, which is somewhat more than what they're paying under the current system. And finally, 4% of the NFIP policyholders will see a $20 or more increase in their monthly premiums. These policies cover high-value homes in high-risk areas. Currently, lower-value homes subsidize these properties, and in many cases are paying way more than their fair share. It's important to note that under both the legacy rating system and risk rating 2.0, 4% of policyholders see premium increases of more than $20 per month, the same under both systems. And just like the old system, risk rating 2.0 will continue to abide by the statutory rate caps set by Congress. As I mentioned earlier, this isn't as a result of risk rating 2.0. Next slide, please. As you can imagine, designing a new rating methodology takes an enormous amount of resources, of time, people, and technology. It didn't happen overnight, and as I like to say, not on the back of a napkin. We relied on state-of-the-art technology and the best available data to create a modern-day rating system that builds and expands upon years of scientific developments, actuarial data, and environmental analysis. The NFIP licensed 3 sets of commercial catastrophe models, AIR Worldwide, Cat Risk, and CoreLogic. And in addition to the commercial models, FEMA developed 2 additional models based on government data. Next slide. Stakeholders have weighed in on the impact that Risk Rating 2.0 will have to communities and policyholders. The National Association of Realtors, representing 1.4 million agents, has backed the new pricing methodology and acknowledged that Risk Rating 2.0 will help ensure that NFIP policyholders pay a rate proportionate to their property risk. And Pew Charitable Trust fully supports our update, saying Risk Rating 2.0 will create a fairer and more transparent program and encourage more mitigation. Next slide. Recently, 16 organizations you see here who actively monitor, advise, and yes, who have criticized the NFIP from time to time, from across the broad spectrum of interested parties, sent a joint letter to Congress strongly endorsing Risk Rating 2.0 and opposing any efforts to delay the modernized rate setting system. I draw your attention to this slide because there are some interesting organizations on the list. This sampling of support reinforces that Risk Rating 2.0 is a needed component of the transformation required to sustain the NFIP for decades to come. Next slide, please. Now, affordability. Affordability was an issue under the outdated methodology and will continue to be a concern with the implementation of the new pricing. We trust the affordability framework FEMA delivered to Congress in 2018 will continue to be a valuable resource as this policy discussion continues. We don't have the authority to do it without congressional action. The President's budget, FY22, includes a legislative proposal, which, if approved, would establish a targeted means-tested assistance program, offering low and moderate income NFIP policyholders a graduated risk premium discount benefit. But, and this is important to note, FEMA would implement the program such that eligible low and moderate income policyholders see both the full risk price and the means tested assistance they receive so they understand their full risk. I look forward to continuing to work with the administration's team and Congress on ways to reduce barriers to purchasing flood insurance and pursuing mitigation options to achieve resiliency for all communities. Also, just as with auto insurance, there are things that individuals and communities can do to lower their flood insurance premiums to make their policies more affordable. NFIP offers incentives for property owners to take actions to mitigate against flood threats, including premium discounts to people who elevate their home or expensive items like HVAC units and hot water heaters. I mentioned CRS earlier. Communities can receive discounts for their policyholders by participating and taking local actions that enhance flood protection. Next slide. We encourage anyone with questions to visit our Equity in Action website at, you can see it here, FEMA.gov NFIP transformation for additional information. As you can see, there are a number of resources, many resources to explain, that help explain, will let you explore all that demonstrates our commitment to transparency from the start of our release of the new methodology. Next slide. So in closing, let me say Risk Rating 2.0 Equity in Action is delivering a more risk-informed, equitable NFIP by providing a clear picture of a single property's flood risk. We are equipping our existing and potential customers with essential information to make more informed decisions to reduce disaster suffering following the destructive impacts of flooding. Thank you all for your time. Andy, I'll pass things over to you so that you can go into more detail on how the changes will affect Southwest Florida.
Great, great, thank you. And so to do that, before we go to my presentation, I'm wondering if we can go back into David's and go to, I think it's the 4th slide. It has the bars. Yes, that one. Sorry. Forward again. One more. There we go. Okay. So in this, David talked about what the national averages were for both the previous rating system, where, as he said, everyone increases, and then what the increases are for risk rating 2.0. On the website, the last slide of his presentation, he gave links to our website where you can drill down into the national data. You can see the data by zip code, you can see it by county, you can see it by state, and there's even been some helpful collaboration from some of our stakeholders where they've taken that data and built it into a viewer. And one thing that we've started doing, and that hopefully we'll be able to share soon in a more robust fashion, is a comparison of these bars at that same level, where we're also giving some information about the replacement cost values used to both set the rates and to determine what the risk is. And this is important. So when David talks about this being equity in action, what does equity mean? Well, I'm an actuary, and as a professional, there's an actuarial standard or practice number 12 that talks about risk classification, and it defines for an actuary what equity is and what fairness is. And what that means is that the rates and the way you classify your risk is directly related to the risk of transfer that's being made. So we make a deal with our policyholders. We say to our policyholders that I am going to cover you anytime there's a condition of flood. And earlier in the day, someone asked one of the presenters, well, what do you mean by flood? What is the definition of flood? In the policy that we have with our policyholders, it says that anytime 2 or more adjacent properties have a condition of flood, and anytime 2 or more acres have a condition of flood, then we're going to pay. And the condition of flood just means that there's water on the ground. It doesn't talk about why the water got there, how the water got there, but when there's the condition of water on the ground, 2 or more properties, 2 or more acres, we are going to be paying for that. And so to define the equity there, we really need to understand what's going to happen anytime that condition of flood exists. And when you flood an expensive home, you're paying higher claims every time it gets wet than you are for a less expensive home. The previous rating system didn't account for directly for that replacement cost value of homes. And so one thing we see is that under the previous rating system, some of those highest increases, some of those ones that are out there in that gray bar, that 4% that David talked about, those actually have some of the lower value homes under the current rating plan. And under the new rating plan, those are usually and the higher value homes. As you move up, the data we have on our website presents it in $10 per month increment tranches up to that $100 per month increase. And what you see is that as we move, we have higher and higher replacement cost value homes seeing the larger increases under the new plan versus under the old plan, the larger increases often have below average replacement cost value homes. Now, what's going on there? What's going on there is a lot of the building stock are older homes that were built prior to flood insurance rate maps existing. And the old way of looking at risk only said, how do you sit relative to a 1% annual chance event? And so what ended up happening is we had a very coarse definition of whether you're exposed or not to flood. It's, are you in a special flood hazard area? Are you not? And how are you built relative to that 1% annual chance event? And we don't know anything else about how your structure is built really, or what kind of floods it's going to be subject to. And so what we find is a lot of older construction. It might not be right up on the coastline, but it is older and it might sit lower inland compared to some other homes. And they usually have lower replacement cost values. Well, once we actually undertook risk rating 2.0 to use a lot of the same kind of robust models that you heard some of the other presenters talk about, when we do that, what we find is that that old classification of a single line and a single flood to define everything you need to know about the risk, it kind of breaks down. And we've been overcharging some people and particularly lower value homes and some of those older homes, and we've been undercharging others, particularly higher value homes and some of those that are very closest to the coast and to the water. And so what does that mean for Florida, and particularly Southeast Florida, is that when you drill down into your numbers, you're actually going to see some differences in Southeast Florida compared to the rest of the state of Florida. So in the rest of the state of Florida, there's about 20% of the policyholders are seeing decreases. Single family homes, it's about 100,000 single family homes are going to see decreases in Florida. Now, Florida has almost 1 million policies, but still, it's a good portion of your single family homes that are going to be seeing decreases. When you move to Southeast Florida, you're not going to see as many decreases. A lot of that has to do with those decreases. Like I said, a lot of them are for the older, lower value homes that have been paying some of the higher premiums the NFIP has. In Southeast Florida, the development is a lot newer. And in that, a lot of the development was built up to certain kind of floodplain management standards. So that makes you a little more resilient, where you're not paying the really high prices some of those older structures are paying. But then again, there is also an aspect of the risk classification about how close are you actually to the coast and subject to storm surge should there be a large hurricane that comes to your area. And a lot of Southeast Florida is very exposed to storm surge. So there are things that are pushing this in both directions in Southeast Florida. You're not going to see the decreases like we are in some of the older areas of Florida, where they're paying some of the higher rates right now. But right now, the Southeast Florida is paying pretty low rates. And so as we do things like we introduce the full range of storm surge probabilities, then there is some room for that lower average premium that Southeast Florida currently has to increase compared to the rest of the state. So it may look initially unfair, but you have to look at the landscape that exists ahead of time. Now, when I dive into Lee and Charlotte counties in Southeast Florida, what I see is that the number of decreases for those counties, like I said. So we've got about 7% of the policies seeing decreases in Charlotte, about 9% seeing decreases in Lee County. For that, there also have fewer policies that were seeing large increases. So in Lee County, you were kind of in line with the average of a 4% under the old plan, seeing large increases. That actually does increase for Lee County to 12%, but it's heavily weighted towards the bottom end of that $10 to $20, $20 to $100 increase range. In Charlotte County, you only had 2.5% of people seeing the increases in that highest gray bar, whereas now you're going to see more people in that with 16% of your policies. Once again, it's heavily weighted in the 20 to 30 category of that $20 to $100 plus gray bar. And what that is really an effect of us recognizing the low-lying area of Southeast Florida. When we look at what's driving our premiums, a lot of it is storm surge. And the 1% annual chance event that a lot of your construction was built around, a 1% annual chance event, there's two things that have happened. As Doug said, there's been some accumulation as sea level has risen, as there's been an increase in the number of storms. When we assess the risk today, it's a little bit higher than when some of this building stock existed. And when you are very low down, when storm surge is able to reach further inland, when those waves, breaking waves particularly, are able to reach some of these homes, it does create higher risk. Now, the good news is, with risk rating 2.0, there's two things that are important to recognize here. And this is getting to the adaptability of climate change. With risk rating 2.0, first of all, people who have existing policies. And in some of the zip codes that you asked me to look at, there's a range of people who in these different zip codes with how many people actually currently have insurance. one of the zip codes that's kind of, if you're, I wish could show you the map. I wasn't able to get it into my presentation. But 33914, it has almost 3/4 of its current households actually have coverage. So there's 15,000 households roughly in that zip code. Almost 11,000 of them have an NFIP policy. In 33904, I've got about 6,000 policies for also about 15,000 households. So we have less penetration in that 33904. And in 3391, smaller overall number of households, 6,500, and 3,300 of them have policies. Now, the reason that I'm saying that is that those people that already have policies, they're going to be on a glide path to their full risk premium. They're going to have 18% caps per year. And so for many of them, they may be paying a very low premium today, a $500 premium. They're going to be on a very slow trajectory to catch up to their full risk rate. Those that don't have policies, like David said, they will immediately pay what their full risk rate is when they join the NFIP. Now, that's one important smoothing effect. The other important smoothing effect is that under the old plan, with these broad zones, with these bright lines, as the climate change that Doug talked about begins to occur, what happens is when we remap, it moves the line. It changes who's going to flood and who's not according to the old mapping system. And when you move that line, there is a huge jump in the treatment of policies in the area of change. So if you were already in the special flood hazard area, change looks pretty minor. If you're outside the special flood hazard area, staying outside of it, change looks pretty minor. But suddenly you get mapped in and the whole system kind of breaks for you. How you're supposed to build, what building standards you're supposed to use, whether or not you're supposed to buy insurance, how much your insurance is going to cost jumps in a quantum fashion, just a huge jump if you get mapped into the special flood hazard area. Risk rating 2.0, we've got this 18% glide path that's helping us out. And as we change and update our models year by year, those models will have a smooth progression as the models change slowly to adapt to the new conditions of risk that we see. The pricing is also able to change in a similar marginal fashion when we have a marginal increase in risk. If you remember back to Doug's presentation where he was showing that really it's kind of a slow curve at first, but if you look at where it's going to be at the end of 10 years, at the end of 30 years, at the end of 100 years, that's when you see that, there's been a measurable change, but year by year, it's a slow change. Risk rating 2.0 equity in action is able to adapt to those changes and help show what risk is going to be like as we move across that time horizon. So with that, in the interest of time, I'm going to say we should go ahead and move to our questions rather than me go in my technical presentation about how these rates were developed more fully. And perhaps I'll address some of what my presentation was going to be as we answer questions. But with that, let's go ahead and questions.
Thanks, Andy.
Well, thank you both. We will now go into Menti. If you haven't already, log into menti.com and enter the code 22912284 and submit your questions. And we'll turn to the questions now and see what we have coming in. We already have quite a few for you. Some of them may have already been covered. Feel free to select the ones that you'd like.
Sure. So, did most policies decrease? I'll start off with that one. So no, nationally for the first time, about 23% of policies decreased compared to 0% decreasing previously. So in the past, 100% saw increases year after year. Now we're looking at roughly 67% will still see increases, with the majority of them seeing increases that are somewhat in line with what the increases in the past have been. Will residential customers buying flood insurance voluntarily be given any discount rates? Properly, it requires mandatory provisions. So, not at the current time. So, we're really trying to move the discussion from required, not required, mandatory, not mandatory in the special flood hazard area to really giving communities and individuals a graduated understanding of the flood risk in their community, and then pricing the insurance according to that risk. So it's going to take time, but one of the unintended consequences of mandatory purchase is the fixation on the line. Which side of the line am I on? And then that's dictating the purchasing decision for insurance. And that's the wrong way to approach understanding what your flood risk is, and then taking steps and measures to mitigate the risk or transfer the risk to the NFIP through insurance. Anything you want to add there, Andy?
Yeah, the one thing I'll say is that when we talk about this single 1% annual chance event, that line that David talked about, already today, we know that there are other floods that can happen than that 1% annual chance event. Florida has actually been one of the states that's really led the way in using catastrophe models to look at the full range of events that can happen, whether it's on the wind insurance side or on the flood insurance side. And when you look at the full range, one thing that we found is that that line on the map that drives mandatory purchase, that drives much of the old rating system, there are ways in which it was blind to the reality of what floods could occur. And so I will say, in the spirit of the conversation that's happened today about resiliency and what it takes to be resilient, if you are shooting for that minimum compliance, when the risk does increase, when it does change, minimal compliance can turn upside down really fast. And so the importance of isn't just about let's talk about what the rates are today, but let's talk about how we create resiliency going forward. And some of that involves things like don't just build to minimum standards. It involves one of the pictures that was shown of an older structure was up on post piles and piers. You're up on post piles and piers, that's better sometimes than dredging and bringing in fill where the water can still come and wash over and hit the house. So there are some ways that risk rating 2.0 incentivizes building up on post piles and piers over building on solid perimeter foundations, particularly in areas where storm surge exists. So there are incentives built into it, but some of them are changing and not necessarily focused on that one line.
Let me move to will the cost of flood insurance in the Florida Keys get to the point in 10 to 20 years that it's unaffordable to average people? The whole affordability aspect of flood insurance, particularly the NFI flood insurance, is really one that I think is misunderstood. We know, because of the affordability framework that we developed for Congress, that for roughly 30% of our current policyholders in the high-risk area, their flood insurance premium is already a burden to them. And when you look at, we're only insuring maybe a third of the properties in the high-risk area, I don't think is much of a leap to say that there's many of those that don't have the coverage, that it is a burden. And so that's why we believe it's important that, along with this rating methodology change, pricing change, that we put forward a new program, which will need congressional approval, to assist low to moderate income policyholders. But I also want to make a distinction that 10 or 20 years from now, if we would have done nothing, it would have exacerbated the problem for those that currently the flood insurance is a burden. And so I want to make sure that when we're doing a comparison, we're doing a comparison with the way the NFIP really was, not the way we hoped it would have been, or some perfect nirvana program of some kind. So affordability will continue to be an issue now, and this is one of the reasons why the realtors support it. People will have an understanding of down the road what their full risk rate will be. And they, the owners, the buyers, and the lenders will be able to take that into consideration as to whether that's a home that they can afford not only this year's payments on, but years to come. So let's see. Is there a mechanism for FEMA to charge more for new development in flood-prone areas, or even not insure such properties, so to encourage your responsible development, protect unknowing for? So, you know, one of the proposals that has been kicked around before has been whether or not the NFIP should insure new development in the high-risk areas. I think that needs serious consideration. Obviously, if that new construction is built according to the community's floodplain regulations, it will be built above, at or above the minimum standards. And it would seem the private sector should be willing or interested in insuring those properties. So right now, there's no basis by which we can prohibit it. But we do believe that not only as we price the insurance, which is a good risk signal, better, that will also help people understand where in a community it's best to have sound development. Existing policies, when will we know if the rate is increasing or decreasing? Good question. We've trained over 20,000 agents on risk rating 2.0. In addition to the thousands of agents that work for the companies that the write your own companies that administer the program on behalf of the federal government. Just as in the past, we encourage our policyholders to have these kinds of discussions with their agents. Generally speaking, companies' agents will send out anywhere from 60 to 90 days before a policy comes up for renewal, before the policy expires, the new premium notice, just like other insurance programs, your auto or your home insurance. But we're strongly advising, encouraging our companies and our agents to have discussions with their policyholders, especially this renewal, during the renewal upcoming, but they should do it every year, quite frankly. And so that folks can know. And so if they call their agent, they're going to be able to determine whether or not and how their premium will be impacted by risk rating 2.0. Is there an easy way to estimate how much a specific policy rate will increase? Is there an online estimator tool? Well, there isn't an online estimator tool at this point. We've had a pretty heavy lift, without patting ourselves on the back, over the course of the last number of years of getting this new methodology rolled out, as I indicated, the investment that it took. But you can go to the website, and there's a worksheet there that should help folks, certainly with agents, be able to look through and see what the rate will be. And with our new risk rating engine, agents can put in different deductible amounts, different coverage amounts, and come up, almost with the snap of a finger, what different options would be for a particular policy. Far less complex and complicated than the old-fashioned way, where you had to go to a manual and use paper and pencil, etc. But Andy, anything more to add on that particular topic?
No, I would say the most important thing is talk to an agent. When you get a flood insurance quote, even if you're a current policyholder, I talked about that 18% glide path, you'll actually get to see what your full risk premium is, and then a reconciliation of discounts you have all the way down to what you would pay with an 18% glide path. So it is, I would say, just to be really transparent, that there are agents that have really kind of jumped on this, and they're up to speed on it. If you talk to an agent and they don't know, they kind of scratch their head at you, ask for help from a different agent, I would say. But we're seeing that we're getting over that hump, and a lot of agents are really getting up to speed, and it's the best way to really understand what your current risk is.
So let me add also when Andy we've mentioned a couple times, the full risk rate, and some people have have been shocked with what the full risk rate is. And one of the things that I like to remind people is before, nobody knew what the full risk rate was. And in fact, we had obviously 1 million policyholders that were way beyond their full risk rate. And so doing nothing, we still wouldn't know what full risk rate is on a particular property. And it could go on up and up and up and up and up. And so there's something to be said, in my view, about the certainty associated with the full risk rate and the current glide path that Congress has put in place. About 25% of our policies will reach full risk rate first year, 50% by year 5, 90% by year 10, which means 10% of our policies are going to be beyond 10 years. They're underpriced so much before they get to their full risk rate. Will rates increase in the event of a claim event is a good question, and I'll let Andy tackle that one.
So in general, if you have a single flood loss, we're not going to increase your rates for the experience of having a single flood loss. Floods don't happen that often, and sometimes you have a small chance of actually flooding, but that small chance occurred for you, but it didn't for someone in some other part of the country. And so with a single loss, your rates are the same no matter what. After we implement risk rating 2.0, no matter how many losses you've had historically, we're also not looking at that when we move into risk rating 2.0. However, once you have a loss, and that together with some other losses, meaning the past 20 years you've had 2 or more losses, then we see that there's strong correlation that's indicative that your risk is higher than everyone else's. So beginning with 2 losses in the past 20 years, you will see increases in premiums due to those additional losses. But once again, no one is going to pay any additional premium for additional losses until risk rating 2.0 is implemented and you have a loss. That's when we'll look back at the 20 years to see how many claims you've got. And all of that, any increase associated with losses, the way that the glide path works that Congress has implemented, those would all be within the 18% glide.
So let me acknowledge the compliment. Thank you. It has been a lot of work, and I know there are a number of you that work in government that are participating in this webinar, and you know how hard change is. And so thank you for the compliment that the teams put in a lot of sweat equity into this, and I can't commend Andy, the actuarial team, the modelers, floodplain management, our engineers that have done such a tremendous job in pulling this together. Quickly, the limit on 250 is still in place. That's statutory. As we work for a multi-year reauthorization, one of the recommendations from FEMA is to look at increasing that and tying it to a Fannie Freddie limit, and so that it would increase normally as costs increase. So we hope to be able to accomplish that. Possible to figure a way to finance the removal of flooded infrastructure. Well, of course, we have our mitigation grant programs, both the hazard mitigation grant program, which is post-disaster, and then also the new pre-disaster mitigation program, the Building Resilient Infrastructure Communities, or BRIC program, and then the flood mitigation assistance grant program that is funded by the NFIP policyholders that target repetitive loss properties to either help elevate them or to have work with communities for buyout programs. Generally in the past, infrastructure, a lot is underway, especially with BRIC. This past year, we doubled the amount with the administration's support to $500 million. That's doubled again to $1 billion for next year. States have all 50 states and 6 territories have received additional mitigation funds through the COVID presidential declarations and HMGP, the administration, including those in the disaster, for those disasters. So all states have additional mitigation dollars. Of course, a lot of the programs are developed through the state, through the sub-applicant and the communities. So we're definitely working. This administration has been tremendously supportive of mitigation, as has Congress. The infrastructure bill that just passed had additional dollars for dam safety, starting anew. The Storm Act was funded, which is we'll start from scratch like we did with BRIC and build a state revolving loan fund for mitigation activities at the that would be managed at the state level. An additional $1 billion for BRIC. So there's more money available for mitigation actions, and we're going to work very diligently with our state, local, tribal, territorial partners to as smartly as possible to use those dollars to help reduce disaster suffering, reduce the flood risk across the country.
Well, thank you both so much. I know everyone was keenly interested in this. It affects our daily lives here in Florida, where we're very prone to sea level rise and hurricanes and other climate factors. So very much appreciated this information and your time to share it with us. And now we are going to go to a short 4-minute bio break. If everyone would mind turning off their cameras and then returning promptly at 3:40. You do not want to miss the final presentation from Dr. Jennifer Gerardo. Dr. Gerardo has really led the way in showing how communities can forge forward to build better community resiliency. And I hope that all of you will stay on to see her amazing presentation in a few minutes. See you in 4 minutes. Bye. All right, if all the participants could start heading back, we're going to be starting here promptly in just a minute or so. All right, welcome back, everyone. Our next presentation is Building Resilience in Broward County from Regional Planning to Local Collaboration by Dr. Jennifer Gerardo. I just wanted to point out that even though this is our last longer presentation, we do have some phenomenal panelists, presenters that are going to be following this, so you'll want to stay on to the very end to catch them as well. With that, next slide, please. Dr. Jennifer Gerardo is the Chief Resilience Officer and the Deputy Director for the Broward County Resilient Environmental Department. Dr. Gerardo is responsible for leading climate resilience and environmental planning initiatives for Broward County, Florida, with a focus on urban adaptation, sustainable resource management, and clean energy strategies. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Gerardo. Thank you.
Hey, thanks very much, Jennifer, and thanks for the opportunity to, participate in the discussion today. Really fabulous presentations, and there's so much to say on any one of the topics. It's, a challenge, and now I'm kind of lamenting any of the things that I would have prepared, but we'll go through what I have today, and I'll be glad to take any questions at the end. So the next slide, please. So I'll be covering a very broad topic, really, which is the regional resilience initiatives that have been developing in Southeast Florida over this last decade, and how we've used the momentum of regional collaboration to support very strategic advancement of initiatives in Broward County, and some of the collaborative efforts that have been very fundamental to the progress in our own county while we've continued to work at a regional scale. I understand, I think that this is a relatively diverse audience, and so I wasn't quite sure where to begin. Of course, we're all here in South Florida, generally speaking, understanding of the complexities of dealing with, rising seas and the history of challenges of flood management. But I think for many of us, we are sensitive to the deep complexity that occurs when you have a relatively shallow groundwater table. We have very intense rainfalls and a deep reliance upon active stormwater management and canal systems for drainage and flood protection historically. And that a lot of this is increasingly challenged by rising seas, coupled with enhanced storm surge and rising groundwater tables. And so our challenges have become more acute with time, especially as we've seen increased development in the area. The projections are, I think, for a total of maybe 13 million in the Southeast Florida area over the next coming decades. And so we see a lot of strain on a system that was not intended to serve a community of 6 million as it is in our region, and then the increasing redevelopment, even with the knowledge of the challenges before us. And I think there's increased recognition that compound flooding is one of the deeper challenges that we have because of the interplay in factors. So the next slide, please. And that has been something well articulated by Noaa, with the acknowledgement that we're really dealing with this trifecta factors, which is this compilation or combination of storm surge, storm events, and high tides. And as I said, the threat becomes increasingly acute where you have a concentration of assets and people. So there may be, as noted, areas of relative sea level rise that are quite a bit higher than what we're experiencing locally, but they may not be as densely populated, or they may have more in the way of natural areas that serve as buffers that help to mitigate for some of those impacts where for many of our communities, it is the urban environment that's the front line. So the next slide, please. And one of the, I guess, impressions that we've really had to dispel over the years is this impression that the risk is limited to the fringe of our coasts, and that this is perhaps a rich person's problem because there is the appearance of wealthy real estate in many of the coastal areas. And while there certainly is more costly real estate or in some of these areas, we also have, as was pointed to, older homes that have been there even pre-FEMA, and not everyone has the same resources to relocate to another area. And further, because we have such a elaborate system of water bodies and interconnected waterways, and in Broward County alone, we have over 1,800 miles of canal and waterways, equivalent to the entire length of the water control district that's within the South Florida Water Control District's management. We have that just in Broward County, and that provides a lot of paths for water movement, also coupled with the stormwater connectivity issues that were discussed previously, how stormwater can move miles inland. So you actually see communities that are nowhere near the coast that are suffering the impacts of rising seas, and maybe not even being able to attribute fully or understand fully that attribution. So the next slide, please. And we have seen in our communities, and I expect many of you are well familiar with the complex ways in which rising seas and increased rainfall substantially challenge our existing infrastructure. We've seen this play out in terms of increased flooding with even minor storm events, as well as just an increase in the sluggishness of operations, whether this relates to drainage systems and it's just taking longer for water to move off the landscape. Some of this because we have higher groundwater table, it means less soil storage. And so even a nominal rainfall event generates an increased flood water and more expansive flooding than we would have seen historically. We also have significant increases in infiltration and inflow to stormwater and wastewater systems. This can result in overflows, very frequent overflows of inadequately and untreated wastewater to our coastal waters, generating environmental challenges. I could speak to the tropical storm Eta of this last, I guess it was a little over a year ago now, where we had across all of South Florida orders not to flush toilets, shower, run dishwashers, or take any kind of typical use of water within our residential and commercial operations, because the system was so overladen with infiltration of groundwater seeping into these systems that there was nowhere for it to go, and the water treatment systems were just beyond taxed. So those are challenges that we see occur today that would become much more typical unless we take a very close look at how some of this and maybe invisible infrastructure is being impacted. We've seen implications for water quality as drainage fields are impacted, and septic systems are no longer functioning as they would have historically, coupled with the demands of much more intense development than perhaps we would have been ideal for the where septic systems remain, and that continues to be an issue throughout our state and including in Broward County. And then challenges to the water management operations, which again, so much of our canals are function as with a reliance upon gravity flow. We don't maybe even have much in the way of pumps, but we just have gates that rely upon downslope movement of water. And that's become lessened and challenged with time. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Next slide, please. And some of this is described in this slide, where we can see just an example from within Broward County, where we only have one pump station in our county. All of the other gates operate, all the other canals, operate with this gate system. So much like the canals I know that exist and the structures on the West Coast, where you've also been realized similar limitations, typically we hold water levels higher on the landward side of these structures, and that helps to push salt water at bay. It keeps our drinking water wells fresh. But in circumstances of storms, we need to be able to open these gates and discharge water. Well, as rising seas are generating higher and higher coastal levels, we're not able to discharge those storm water with just as we would have intended. Perhaps we're having to wait for those high tides to drop down before we can discharge, or maybe when we're opening the gates, the gravity difference, that head difference between high and water and low water levels isn't what it used to be. So water moves more slowly than it used to. So all in all, what we're seeing in Broward County is more water being stored all the time across the entire landscape, including these very western reaches of our county. And we anticipate with time, we will see more of this convergence of upstream water levels and downstream water levels, like you see in this bottom picture, where the water levels are the same. And so we have to have a pump to move water, whereas historically it was designed where you can see in the image upstream water levels being higher in blue, downstream being shown in red, and preserving that gradient is what's been critical to the historic operations of the system. This is a major issue for our communities in Southeast Florida, which I'll be talking more about. And I think it's a major issue for communities across South Florida. Next slide, please. I did touch briefly on the issue of saltwater barriers and the salinity control structures themselves. And I think that we have perhaps understated the exposures of water supplies, as over the last 10 years, our responses have been so much driven by what's happening with the very visible impacts of flood events and high tides in particular. But in this graphic on the right, you can see where is the historic saltwater intrusion line within our aquifer. This is, of course, Broward County, and all the wells are obviously strategically located to the west of that line, or they've been moved to the west of that line as the line has progressed. And you can see in these series of images on the left from 1994 to 2019, the total square miles of Biscayne aquifer beneath our feet that has been intruded by salt water over the decades, most of which is in fact driven by historic drainage and the rise in sea level rather than continued withdrawals. We've actually had restrictions on withdrawals for some time. We know that saltwater intrusion is accelerating by a factor of 2, doubling the rate of saltwater intrusion into the well fields. And this is an area of necessary mitigation, as well as we're looking at above ground adaptation strategies. Next slide, please. And so we see these exposures play out also in terms of shoreline protection. One of the more impactful circumstances has been that we've seen these passage of major storms. Maybe we don't see an event right away, we lose a lot of beach, and then a month later comes an extreme high tide event, and all of a sudden a major collapse of roadways. This has actually happened twice. One was far more significant than the other, but it speaks to what happens when we have this loss of this buffer, which is our beach, and then you can have a very minor event that results in a very acute impact sometime after the actual event or the actual exposure. And we have a couple of these events that have really reinforced the importance of beach preservation and dune enhancement as part of our shoreline protection strategies, really emphasizing the nature-based solutions that were discussed previously. And in fact, we've subsequent to coming together as a region, which was referenced as part of the compacts, we've established shared goals in terms of managing or integrating dunes into our beaches because it is such an important shoreline protection strategy. Next slide, please. And so speaking of the regional collaboration, these types of exposures, while some of them point to more recent events, they were being realized throughout the region, not just in Broward County. Certainly, we all have been experiencing climate change impacts in one form or another. And as we started really having more of documentation of what was taking place, more of our communities were individually working on these actions or on these initiatives. And it became very clear in the 2009 timeframe when our leadership across Southeast Florida was operating jointly in DC, and we were all talking about how we were responding, developing separate sea level rise projections, vulnerability assessments, emissions inventories, et cetera, with no collaboration happening, despite the fact that we were utilizing the same technical resources. We share, reefs, beaches, transportation systems, our economies are so interconnected. So it became very clear to our leadership, kind of to Mike's point, about the value of collaborating and taking advantage of the shared investments and not duplicating efforts and sharing expertise and accelerating our actions across the region. And since we formally formed our 4-county compact in 2010, I think it's just been really like a roller coaster in terms of how much has been advanced, despite knowing that we still have so much more ahead of us. Thinking about where we would have been versus where we are, I think we find that it's been a very lucrative effort, and for many reasons. We're still waiting for the windfall of funds, but lucrative in many other ways. Next slide, please. And so it's now a full 11 years since we have come together. We're getting ready, though, to host our 13th annual summit just this next week. We have generated a number of regional documents that support our voluntary collaboration on both mitigation and adaptation. We have a shared action plan. We have unified sea level rise projection. In fact, we've produced our 3rd iteration of our sea level rise projection that's been adopted by all 4 counties, and I would say over half of our cities, as the basis for how we approach adaptation planning. The emissions inventory that I mentioned, and then a work product that was quite significant in the last 18 months or so was the regional business case for resilience. So, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Next slide, please. Before I move into the technical work products, because I didn't want to lose the opportunity to just reinforce that in addition to the technical work that we undertake, we also commit, because we committed to working on these technical work products, policy at state and federal levels. We committed to supporting a staff group, but we also committed to the annual hosting of this compact summit, which would allow leadership and all the stakeholders in our community to come together on an annual basis to really assess progress and help define necessary priorities and direction. So we are thrilled that after 12 years, we're now preparing to host the 13th annual summit, a responsibility that rotates among our 4 counties. And this year is being hosted by Palm Beach County in a virtual environment. And next year will be hosted by Broward County. So if any of you have interest, I think the registration is only $75, a 2-day event. Registration is still open, and we have a phenomenal program. And I really hope that you might find that of interest and value in any of the areas of climate work that you're involved with. The next slide, please. So one of the most significant technical work products has been the regional sea level rise projection. And perhaps this isn't as monumental today as it was 10 years ago. And now we see that the state too is referencing, the same curves that we've been using. But it was a big effort when we all had different curves at one point in time. But what is important is that as we've updated the curve, we've agreed on the timeframes for planning, on the length and duration of the projection. It accounts for regional variability in sea level rise. And this last year was a big step because in 2019, when it was last updated, we shifted the planning horizon. Now that we've worked together for 10 years, rather than looking at the 50-year planning horizon and benchmarking efforts to 2060, we now collectively look at 2070. So we've adjusted our principal scenarios from the predicted 2-foot sea level rise in 2-foot rise in sea level to now what is about a 3.3-foot rise. And this affects decisions such that relate to our land use, all types of infrastructure, drainage, finished floor elevations for flooding, which we just heard our FEMA representatives talk about, and other types of development and redevelopment strategies. Next slide, please. And with the collective adoption of that sea level rise projection, we've now been applying it to different planning requirements within Broward County. This includes our integration of a priority planning area as part of our county's land use plan. This is the image is shown here, where we have done initially a kind of the superficial mapping of just the vulnerability assessment based upon elevation and predicted rise in sea level. It doesn't take into account the complexity of what's happening with the rise in the groundwater table or how you're managing floodwaters with your canal system, which I'll talk about. But as a first assessment, this is very useful, because if we have a land use amendment that comes into our county, for example, we have countywide authority on land use, we view that assessment relative to the mapped area. If it falls within this mapped area, which indicates increased risk of flooding with now 3.3 feet sea level rise, and this was adopted in 2020 and without objection. It's our third update to this map. It now moves into another area of review, and we provide comments as an agency oriented around resilience and the extent to which flood risk is being adequately addressed as part of the proposed amendment. And if it's not, future conditions flood risk, and if it's not adequately addressed, that's in our comments, and we may and have opposed land use amendments. Those initial statements of opposition have resulted in several instances, and there were three that are on my mind, and only and each one of them has been corrected, which is where the developer or the city has come back and has amended their commitment in order to gain the endorsement of our agency based upon the resilience components. And those have been projects that we've subsequently been able to stand behind, and they've been voluntary changes. So because the planning council or the commission could ultimately take an action inconsistent with the staff recommendation, but in order to gain the staff recommendation, the developer has still moved forward, or the city, with the requested changes. So it's been a very significant policy and planning tool. We've also established formally a future conditions map series as part of our code of county ordinances, which relates to the regulatory standards as part of our licensing of drainage systems for seawall heights, as well as for finished floor elevations for structures. And I'm going to speak about each of those subsequently. Next slide, please. So the first map in our series that was established occurred in 2017. It's been in place since 2017, and we are in the process of updating now with the 3.3 foot sea level rise scenario, but it was initially built upon 2 feet. And what this map is a modeling of the predicted change in the groundwater table with sea level rise. And this was important because we were already seeing changes in the groundwater table. We'd already seen a foot change, just as was described in terms of the amount of sea level rise that's occurred over the past 100 years. We were seeing that in the monitoring wells, and the modeling that the USGS performed for us indicated, as you see in the graphic on your left, in the red areas, that's where we predict a 1-to-1 relationship between the rise in the groundwater table relative to the amount of sea level rise. And so I don't have time to go through each of the figures, but we had the historic groundwater table in the dashed blue line in the middle, the modeled change in elevation with the solid blue line, and land surface shown in brown. This is a cross section across Broward County. You can see in the eastern portion of the county is where you would see the most amount of change. And that is what is now part of the required data that is used to set the drainage requirements that pertain to things like retention areas, amount of infiltration trench, whether or not pumps might be required for drainage wells, all part of the licensing for, again, new development and major redevelopment today. Next slide, please. And that's set to basically the 2050 planning horizon. The next exercise we undertook involved collaboration with the Army Corps of Engineers. We knew that we were seeing, and we continue to see, a lot of overtopping of seawalls during extreme high tide events, overtopping that wasn't occurring historically. We worked with them to model the predicted coastal water elevation with 2 feet of sea level rise, high tides, extreme high tides, and a high frequency storm surge of about 1 foot additional setup. We use that modeling to inform a recommendation for a consistent seawall top elevation, not just seawalls, but berms and marinas, anything that would potentially serve as a barrier or conduit to tidal waters. And with that, we were able to successfully establish a minimum requirement that is now part of our land use plan. It's embedded in our code of county ordinances, and the cities in Broward County have until March of this year in order to adopt that standard. And it's one of the compliance requirements that we look at as part of that land use plan process. So if a city were not to support that ordinance and we would have continued land use amendments coming in, that would be a basis for which we would not support those land use amendments and would see and anticipate more denial. So in the end, we have not had a pushback. In fact, the community was very interested in having a target and having consistency that could deliver a consistent level of flood protection. Next slide, please. With that work, we then worked on updating the finished floor elevation requirements in our community. We use a number of tools to set finished floor, including the FEMA flood maps, but we also have other maps in our county, which have been future conditions maps. The map historically looked at the future condition of build out of our community, but we've been long built out and we hadn't updated that map to account for other changes that had occurred, including the change in sea level as it affects all of our flood management infrastructure. So we then applied our models to model flood elevations for the 3-day 100-year storm with rainfall intensification of 13%, which was another technical process. And you know, there's questions about how the change in rainfall intensity, what that will look like through future conditions. So we ended up in this process with a 13% intensification. We also modeled a supersaturation of the ground, so no additional soil storage, and that's consistent with how FEMA models as well. As a result, we generated new flood elevation maps. We converted the model output into flood areas. We converted that into a new tool, and the map on the right in blue, those areas show where the county's flood elevation is higher than the FEMA elevations, both the FEMA elevation for the inland waterways as well as the coastal A zone. Where the FEMA elevation is higher is in green, and that's really in the coastal A zones, and you can see that information here. Next slide, please. I can see that I've run out of time. I'm just going to say that the model scenarios that we looked at were consistent with what we experienced during Tropical Storm Eta, reinforcing the model approach. Next slide, please. We were able to demonstrate its applicability to both residential and commercial structures, as shown here, indicating that should redevelopment occur, that top blue line is the new elevation that would be required today. Those other lines showing other elevations that have been used historically. Next slide. A commercial application in terms of the amount of insurance savings to be derived by building to a higher elevation. And basically there's a doubling in the flood insurance for every foot below the FEMA flood elevation you fall. So our intent is to continuously stay higher by planning for a more aggressive situation. That also supports the community discounts that were referred to earlier. Next slide. And I'm just going to skip through, just go ahead another slide, please. And I'm not going to have time to talk about it. I'm just going to acknowledge collaboration with the business community has been strong. It's helped to support the advancement of these standards through economic evaluations. We've been able to demonstrate a significant return on investment. And without going into additional slides, the final phase of our planning efforts today is to convert these model scenarios to a countywide resilience plan that encompasses our 31 cities, an infrastructure improvement plan and redevelopment strategies with planning level cost estimates and quantified risk reduction that could ultimately serve as the basis for a multi-decade investment plan. So that's what we're working on today, all attributed to the regional work with the compact and the strong support of the business community and the engagement of so many others. So I'm going to go ahead and conclude there, and thanks for the opportunity to contribute to the discussion.
Well, thank you so much. I know we were all very interested in that. If everyone can put in their questions right now at menti.com. Next slide, please. The code is at the top here, and it looks like we already have a couple for you to answer.
I'll just begin with the question relating to the Southwest Florida climate impact. I would acknowledge that our collaboration with the business community has been one of the most fruitful aspects of the regional work. Those used to be maybe annual invited conversations. Now they're nearly weekly collaborations. And we just had a major event with the business community this morning, one last week. Resilience, climate resilience as part of the 6-pillar economic development process. So I would say that senior leadership in the business community appreciate the economic implications of inaction versus action. We see more and more a need to be responsive to inquiries by risk rating entities, potential investors about the robustness of the resilience efforts. And it's one thing to have a narrative, and it's another to be able to really point to discrete actions and how that is significantly, through coordinated implementation, anticipated and designed to reduce risk. So it's beyond the kind of the goal, and we can point specifically to how it's being embedded in our process, but that doesn't happen unless you've got really strong endorsements. And that was a collaborative kind of partnership and a development of trust that happened with time. And I think really being able to speak not just about long-term economic exposures, but immediate economic returns of investment, whether it relates to job opportunities, whether it relates to preservation of tax base, whether it relates to insurance affordability, protection of the housing and real estate markets. There's a lot that goes into that. And so I would say, trying to develop that relationship and cultivating that and finding opportunities for a joint dialogue there. The business community's platform is very different from that of local government. It's an entirely different audience. And when it comes to advocacy for investments that are important in the community, the business community has an ear with leadership that is perhaps different from that when local government is communicating. So again, that's been very rewarding. How do we better protect freshwater aquifers? Well, one of the projects that I didn't have a chance to talk about was that of the C51 reservoir. So in addition to water conservation, which is the most important out of the gate, I think you have the opportunity to diversify water sources through reclaimed water. I think the West Coast has been more aggressive in that regard and can certainly celebrate successes there. But we've also looked at opportunities for increasing storage and being able to move water more through more flexible systems to provide aquifer recharge to help push back against saltwater intrusion. And as a region, we've been working 13 years on the development of an in-ground surface water reservoir, a project that provides storage, helps with flood protection, and also creates a water source that can be redistributed for that purpose. And it is an important long-term strategy and one that can't be afforded by individual communities. And I think it's a very stormwater reuse, was an important investment for us to be making, especially since it's not just about managing floodwaters, but also drought conditions that we sometimes forget about that will be exacerbated by climate change itself.
Well, there's no doubt that you guys are ahead of us in Southwest Florida, and we really appreciate you sharing your wisdom and experience with us. And I encourage those who didn't get their questions answered to reach directly out to Dr. Gerardo. Unfortunately, we're short on time, so we're going to have to move on now to the next presenter. We actually have two that are co-presenting from the Sarasota Students for Climate. And their bios are here, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to be very quick in saying that we are very fortunate to have both of them here today to share their information with us. So with that, I will turn it over to them now.
Hello, everyone. Here, Mahek just turned on their camera. My name is Anya Schwartzbauer. I use she, her pronouns. You saw my bio just now. But yeah, I'm in high school, and this is Mahek.
My name's Mahek. I use they, them pronouns, and I go to Booker High School.
And we are the co-leads of Sarasota Students for Climate, which Mahek will explain about in just a second. Before we do, we wanted to tell you a little bit about ourselves. So me personally, I got into climate activism because I've always been kind of influenced. I've always been more politically inclined just because of how my parents are. They're politically inclined. And I would always look forward to frost in the grass in the wintertime when I was little, living in Florida. And just over the past decade, that frost has disappeared and I don't see it anymore. And we see these record highs that are glossed over in the news. And it really grinded my gears. And I knew that there was something I had to do. And with what I had learned and the research I had done, I knew that there was a better way to go about this than just sitting around and feeling bad for the planet. So that's how I found about SS4C and I started to get involved.
So my story of how I got involved in fighting for climate change is that when I was younger, well, still now, like a tradition in my family is to go up to the Blue Ridge Mountains. And I would always enjoy spending time in nature. I love being in nature and seeing I love it there. It's so beautiful. So as I got older, I started to realize that all the places that I love so much are starting to be destroyed. And I used to always look forward to going out and seeing other places around the globe. Like obviously right now I'm really young. I can't go and like travel and stuff. So it's like when I get older and I get a job and I'm like financially stable, I'll go and travel and see all these things, but all these things that I want to see are getting destroyed because of the effects of climate change. So I started to get a lot of climate anxiety. And then I found out about SS4C through school and I was like, I have to do this because instead of just sitting around and feeling anxious, I was like, I might as well put my effort towards something so I can feel like I'm making a difference and trying to take care of our planet.
Right. And then Mahek, do you want to talk about what SS4C is?
So SS4C is an organization, our organization. It was founded in 2019 by Elijah Merman. They were inspired by Fridays for Future. And they founded SS4C because they wanted to create a place where students in Sarasota could fight for climate change. SS4C remains a student-led organization. We have a team of 13 students and they each have their own roles to all like contribute.
Right. Yeah.
So some of our goals for SS4C is well, our founder's goal was just to unite students under climate activism and raise awareness of the climate crisis. Even though our organization is just a small part of the whole climate movement, it may be small, but it's still a reminder that while you may seem alone, there's people who feel the same way and want to fight for the climate the same way you do.
Right. Once we feel powerless, they start winning. And that's the message that Elijah has always really wanted to portray, that we always thought was really important to share with all of our members and with all of our followers on Instagram, our newsletter members, and whatnot. Other goals we've had are to push and promote green energy and climate progressive mitigation bills in local government and as well in state and federal positions. Locally, we've done a lot of stuff. We can get really hands-on because we have connections, but from state and federal, we just do our best to organize call campaigns, create lines of communication with people that are in positions of power in the state and federal government, and so on. We also want to show that even though we can't vote, students can make a difference. With the successes that we're going to share with you in just a few moments, show that even though we can't check off a box on a ballot doesn't mean that we can't push and promote for ideals that that prioritize our planet and prioritize fighting and acting against climate change. And with that being said, we'll go ahead and head into our successes, our organization's successes over the time that we've been running. So recently, just about a year ago, we began to become in contact with Sarah Kane, who works in sustainability for Sarasota County. We've had a meeting with her last year, and we have one coming up in January with her to talk about initiatives that are going on in the local government as far as climate mitigation and climate action goes. And that's been a really cool contact to have. And while we've met with her, we've tried to promote ideals from the Ready for 100 campaign that talks about green new energy and implementing that into our government. We've also talked, we're going to be interviewing Nikki Fried on December 12th to learn more about how the state government is going to be implementing sustainable change and green energy, as well as to just promote those ideals to her and form that line of communication to begin to understand what's going on in state government and how we can make a change from Sarasota. We also have attended the Power Shift Network conference, where we've learned a lot about the intersectionality of climate change. That was a really cool opportunity. Heck and I attended in 2021, and a few of our members also attended back in 2020. We worked with the Green New Deal Network and organized a rally outside of Vern Buchanan's office to promote the reconciliation bills. And yeah, Mehek can share a few of our other successes as well.
So we also frequently hold strikes of our own to bring attention to climate change and bring people together. So pre-COVID, we used to have huge strikes, and we would have a turnout of like hundreds of people. But since COVID has happened, we had to first stop striking because obviously it wasn't safe. But now, since COVID's come down a little bit and people have vaccines, we started doing COVID safe strikes with masks are like mandated, and also we keep everything socially distanced. The turnout isn't as much, but it's still nice to come together and like have a sense of community. And then also we like to intersect art and climate justice because many people in our team are creatives and use art to express their feelings on climate change. So we've done a couple of installations of art. One we did a year ago when the 2020 elections were going on. We did a voting installation because though we can't vote, we still want people to put their voices out there and like vote. Just, it doesn't matter who you're voting for, just vote because you need to have your voice heard. Another thing we did was do a collaboration with Our Climate, where we submitted art pieces to a mosaic of a manatee that was put in front of, I think, Anya, was it the?
It was in Tallahassee, the Capitol building, I believe.
Yeah, the Capitol building. And we're currently working on starting an art competition for climate. So that is in the works. And another thing we do is with Fridays for Future, they have like the climate strikes every Friday. So we did our own thing where we have climate strikes online. So everyone can use their creative energy towards making a piece, and then we post it with a caption of something that they like, how they're feeling or something, or anything that's like relevant to what's going on right now.
Well, I hate to cut you guys short, but that is so wonderful to hear and really impressive what you guys have already accomplished. And I'm so glad you dropped your information in the chat so that people can follow up with you and know that you're there and that you're making a difference. So, you know, thank you for your efforts and sharing that with us. And unfortunately, these lightning talks go really quick. So we're going to have to move on to the next lightning talk, but thank you both.
Yes, thank you for having us.
With that, I'm going to turn it over to Ariel from the Climate Reality Leadership Corps. Ariel.
Hi everyone. Such wonderful presentations. I think I could spend 2 days listening to them. Yes, the Climate Reality Project is an organization that is worldwide, and we have a chapter here in Southwest Florida. that covers Lee County, but the climate reality is all over Florida, and they have chapters in lots of places if anyone is interested. I wanted to talk about, I can't do next slide, so I think I need next slide. This you have already seen from another presenter, but it's enough to make you stop to think. I wanted to talk about heat, because heat is causing a rapid increase in moisture in the sky, which of course causes extreme downpours. And maybe you've heard about atmospheric rivers as well. We have the equivalent of the Mississippi, 25 Mississippi rivers sometimes in our atmospheric rivers that are carrying moisture. So it's no wonder that we're having these extreme downpours. And you can see that by the year 2070, the IPCC suggests 21 inches of sea level rise. Well, I know that Sanibel may not be here then if it does that. And certainly all other areas of Florida will, or at least coastal Florida, will be affected. Next slide, please. We can't adapt our way out. We need to mitigate our climate impacts, basically. Next slide, please. So here are the top 10 cities at risk from sea level rise, and Miami is #1. And you saw some slides from that today. They're already getting sunny day flooding from time to time. But look at all these major cities that are at risk, and you understand that there will be tremendous unrest in the United States and in the world because people will have to move. And this is will increase instability in our political world. Next slide, please. So we know that climate change is a social and racial justice issue. Primarily Black people and people of color and poor people are disproportionately affected because of redlining from the past, and also from other efforts to keep them out of the neighborhoods that have a better situation. And another fact that I think is really painful, it's the one that got me started when I heard it at the climate reality training, was that little African-American kids are 10 times as more likely to die from asthma than white kids, because many African-American neighborhoods are disproportionately affected by polluting industries. And we see this especially if you look at New Orleans. Next slide, please. So here's the problem, and this is what is making us so hot, which is also contributing to the extreme downpours. We're putting 162 million tons of global warming pollution into our atmosphere every 24 hours. When I first took the training in 2017 in Pittsburgh, it was 110 million tons. So you can see we're going in the wrong direction. We're trapping too much heat. Next slide, please. So here are the sources. These are the biggest sources of greenhouse gases. We have coal plants, obviously coal mining, mining in general, oil production, airplanes, taking airplane trips, industrial agriculture, all of those. But the greatest one of all is burning of fossil fuels. Next slide, please. You can see from this map, next slide, it will build. You will see how it has increased since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in 1850. And I don't even have the slides for 2020, and that will show an increase when I do get them. Next slide, please. 19 of the 20 hottest years on record have occurred since the year 2002. And next slide, please. The hottest years of all have been the last 7. Next slide, please. Last year in July, they came out with the statistic that it's been the hottest year on record in Florida so far. And the average temperature, you can see how it continues to go up. And This is really dangerous. I want you to think for a moment about the workers in Immokalee who are farm workers who are growing our food, and how dangerous it is for them to work in this heat, not to mention the climate effects, but the human effects of that. And it will continue to get more and more serious if we don't do something. Okay, next slide, please. We know in 1960 there were 139 days of 90 degrees or above, but now it's 165 days in Fort Myers. So it keeps going up. And if we don't do something about it, our town's just not going to be viable to live in. Next slide, please. Again, I wanted to share that low-income urban neighborhoods and communities of color are more vulnerable to this heat because of the heat island effect. That means there's a lot more pavement and cement and stuff, less trees too, in their neighborhoods. So obviously they won't be as cool as some of the neighborhoods with more trees and less pavement. And this again shows the injustice. When you go across the bridge in Fort Myers over into Dunbar, you see some, for example, a cement factory, which is putting out a lot of pollution and causing problems for the health of the people in that neighborhood. And that's an African-American neighborhood in Fort Myers. When I first got down here, I said, I'm going to prove this to myself. So I drove around to see where some of the polluting industries were. And this, I found out that this actually is the truth. And yeah. Okay, next slide, please. Well, we have solutions. I don't want you to feel discouraged. We have all the solutions that we need to solve this issue. Next slide, please. We have a lot of clean energy technologies, as you can see, and the price keeps going down. Next slide, please. Again, keep going. Wind, costs of wind energy is going down, and EV batteries are going down, and LEDs are going down. So the clean energy, the prices are going down and they're more affordable. Hey, you guys, we have 265 days of sun a year in Southwest Florida. Not having solar energy on every house here is a disgrace in my mind, because first of all, we have it, we are saving money, but we can feel good at night or when we run our air conditioning. And I really encourage all of you to think about getting solar energy, because it really is the right thing to do, and it's timely. When I first started talking about these issues in 2017 and 2018, 2019, actually, New Jersey had more solar than we do, but now we finally passed them, and I'm thrilled that Florida is catching up. Okay, next slide, please. So in 2014, electricity from solar and wind was cheaper than new coal and gas plants in only 1% of the world. Next slide, please. By 2019, only 5 years later, solar and wind provided the cheapest source of new electricity in 2/3 of the world. And the last slide, please. By 2024, these sources are expected to provide the cheapest source of new electricity. So in the entire world, not just here. So we get enough solar energy every hour to power our energy needs for a whole year. Keep going, please. And we know that wind could supply worldwide electricity consumption 40 times over. I wish I had time to tell you about Texas. Texas has a lot of wind, and they are putting in windmills everywhere. And even some towns that have Republican mayors are choosing it because they say it's cheaper, more reliable, and people like to frequent the businesses that use it. It makes them feel better. I think if we talk to people about renewable energy as a plus for their business, they would be more likely to choose it. Okay,
Thank you, Ariel. I'm afraid we're out of time, but I think you're wrapping up right now that you're emphasizing how much, we have to look forward to, that these solutions are coming into fruition to be cheaper and more available.
Right.
So thank you. Would you mind putting your information in the chat for anyone who might want to follow up with you? Your email?
Oh, yes, of course, I will. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. We're going to move over to the Clio Institute. Salome.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Salome Garcia. I have 20 slides and 7 minutes, so I'm going to move through them really quickly. But thank you so much, Jennifer, and let me know when I'm getting close to time. So the Clio Institute is an organization that was founded in South Florida. You can go to the next slide. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan educational organization that works with science partners such as NASA and the CDC at the local, national, and international level. Next slide. I am the policy and campaigns manager. I grew up in Hialeah, but I now live in Tallahassee, leading our legislative affairs team. Next slide. So this is, in the very next slide, this is something that we're all really very familiar with, the greenhouse gas effect. It's a great thing. We love the greenhouse gas effect. It keeps our planet very warm. Next slide, and you can click that twice. And the problem is, next slide, that too many greenhouse gas emissions in our atmosphere means, like Ariel just pointed out, that the Earth is getting hotter. And I'm just gonna go through the next couple of slides very quickly. So you can press next. This extreme heat, as Ariel mentioned, is not impacting everyone the same way, which is why the Clio Institute takes a route of climate and environmentalism called intersectional environmentalism, which means that we're prioritizing both the people and the planet. This is not something that I'm sure will shock many of you. As Ariel mentioned, she's noticed it in her neighborhood as well. But the fact is that the color of our skin and our background does impact the level of pollution that we're exposed to. In fact, Latinx Americans are exposed to 63% more pollution than they produce, and Black Americans are exposed to 56% more pollution. This is around the world, and this is just from 2015. So I'm sure the numbers now are even more startling. Next slide. And this is not something that's new. We know that race is the most significant predictor of whether a person is going to live next to a toxic waste facility, for example, or contaminated air, water, or soil. We know that people of color are actually twice more likely to live without drinkable water. They're 38% higher nitrogen dioxide exposure, and 56% of the population live near toxic waste sites. Next slide. And this is because we're facing a lot of the impacts of climate change, which Ariel mentioned. So I'm going to move through these slides pretty quickly as well. Next slide. The world's getting hotter, so we're facing extreme heat. Ariel mentioned some of those repercussions in Fort Myers. I live in Tallahassee, so I included some Tallahassee slides. Hottest temperature on record is 105 degrees, and we are on course to have 50 days per year with a heat index above 105. That makes it difficult and dangerous for our kids to play outside, for our fire department to work outside in their uniforms, even for high school students that play football to be practicing outside in their uniform. Next slide. And it also has some mental health impacts. We know that after extreme weather events like hurricanes, people lose their homes, and we actually have severe increases of anxiety, depression, PTSD, and unfortunately, mental health impacts affect disproportionately impacted communities a lot more. You're a low-income person, you lose your home or you lose the ability to go to work for a week, that can impact your entire life for a lot longer than a week. Next slide. And of course, as Ariel mentioned as well, this has huge food insecurity impacts as well. As temperatures increase, our soil and our agriculture becomes less secure. And as you all know, here in Florida, we depend a lot on our agriculture, but not only here in Florida, but all over the world as well. 56,000 people are food insecure in Leon County, which is where Tallahassee is. And this county is actually ranked 4th in the state for highest food insecurity rates. Next slide. Which creates a lot of food deserts and food swamps. So a food desert or a food swamp, as I'm sure some of you know, is an area where residents can't have easy access to green produce or healthy meals. Next slide. And I'm sure nobody needs an introduction to what this means for sea level rise and for hurricanes. It has terrible impacts all over the state, but as Ariel also mentioned, some of the cities that are most impacted include cities like Miami. Next slide. But the Clio Institute is doing a lot of really great work in order to solve some of these issues and to try to tackle some of the impacts of the climate crisis. Next slide. With an emphasis on racial and social justice, we have our Empowering Resilient Women program, where we meet with women in the community and teach them how to create urban gardens, donate gardens to their homes, and then work with the woman long-term to make sure that we're creating green open spaces to build some of that green infrastructure in urban communities. Next slide. We also work with youth and kids all over the state, creating advocacy opportunities for some of those policy solutions Ariel mentioned, like clean energy solutions. Next slide. We have certificate programs to build climate and energy literacy, both online and in person. The picture on the left is persons of giving a tour of a solar farm up here in Tallahassee. Next slide. And we have roundtable discussions with members of all ages and demographics from around the state. Next slide. We have a ton of different ways to get involved with the Clio Institute. I'm going to put my information in the chat, and thank you again so much for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you. Very much appreciate all that you all are doing. And now we're going to turn to our next group, Pachamama Alliance Southwest Florida, and Gary Robbins. I'll turn it over to you.
Sorry about the delay.
No problem.
Okay, thank you very much. Wish to extend special thanks to DEP and everybody else who has been involved in getting this program together today, and for the inclusion of Pachamama, Southwest Florida, and the other community-based organizations. It's a wonderful symbol of inclusion as we face our climate code red in the days and the years ahead. I also want to acknowledge that I'm sitting on the land of the Calusa, a landscape they had relied upon for their sustenance and very lives, until a day in 1513 when they visited a representative, visit by a representative of the 1493 Doctrine of Discovery. Things would never be the same for them again, and we are the heirs of that great change. For some of you, you may not know the name Pachamama. It is a word from Peruvian Quechua language, which means earth, the sky, and all of time. And some 25 years ago, founders of Pachamama Alliance were called to Ecuador to help them with environmental issue. And they ended up actually helping them protect the homeland by assisting in the creation of the first in the world Rights of Nature National Constitution. But once that was done, the Achuar elders requested that the founders head back north and change the dream that we live by, because the dream that we live by is killing them. And so the founders came north, founded the Alliance, Pachamama Alliance, and established the goals to create an environmentally sustainable, spiritually fulfilling, socially just human presence on the planet. And our programs are largely designed to stimulate commitment to engage in positive personal growth and climate leadership. Pachamama Alliance of Southwest Florida, we started in 2016, and through the work of our Awaken the Dreamer, Change the Dream symposiums, and our 8-week Game Changer online course, and Thursday night Pacha gatherings, we have touched many lives in Southwest Florida and in turn been inspired by their actions. In 2018, we formed a Council of Elders to help support the work of implementing various priority efforts to reverse global warming, as outlined in Paul Hawkins' book called Drawdown. The elders established also a climate action fund to provide a variety of projects associated with elements of the Drawdown solutions. Then in 2019 and 20, we formed the Southwest Florida Reset Center, a regional hub inspiring consensus and collaboration in resetting human impacts on global warming and ecological systems through education, advocacy, and action. And RESET stands for Restorative, Ecological, Social, Economic Transformation. We're committed to focus on the root causes of the various crises we face in this bioregion. But the root causes of all of our crises are very deeply embedded in our social and political concepts and structures. In the very way we think and conceive of issues and the language we use to communicate. Many of the concepts are based on perspectives of the nature of reality that are based on thinking that are hundreds of years old, ideas that we are all separate from each other and from all of nature. And everything outside of us individually is other. And what is other is an object to which we can do virtually anything. The process of othering allows us to rape and pillage any part of nature and is just a bunch of resources. It's what allows us to treat each other as objects. It's what permits slavery, racism, sexism, and all of the other inequities built into the institutions of our society. Quantum physics, however, on the other hand, has confirmed what some of the sages of ages past have professed, and that is that we are all interconnected and interdependent, and we are all part of the great one, the collective or the field. Now, RESET was established and focuses on a number of issues, including eco-spirituality, resilience ecology, reset conversations where we invite experts in to talk about the various issues. We have those available on our online, I should say online at our website. And regenerative agriculture is one of the major things that we're dealing with throughout the area. And it's made up of many practices that together help build healthy soil and armor the soil with cover crops, sequester carbon, do all kinds of wonderful things. But they also use no fertilizer, herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, and growing healthier and more productive crops at the same time. Such practices, if widely used in Florida, would greatly reduce agricultural runoff that feeds our algal blooms and would thus be creating a much more mutually supportive human-earth relationship. We also deal with rights of nature and right to clean water, including our interest in a state constitutional amendment to guarantee every citizen of the state of Florida a right to clean water, an issue in which the people of the state are way ahead of the state legislature, as an Orange County Clean Water Charter Amendment passed in November 2020 with the support of 89.22% of those voting. And it's very similar to the 170 years ago. A lot of folks probably thought it was crazy to grant women the right to vote. And today, we can't imagine depriving women of the right to vote. And in the future, we believe we will see clearly that it is the same with granting rights to nature and to citizens' right to clean water. We can't do this alone, however. And so we've got to do the spiritual work to get to the heart of the issues that separate us. And then we've got to work together to work on real solutions. And we've got the solutions. We've got to have the political will to be able to do it. So thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. And I have I think I have put on my chat, I've included some contacts for you.
Wonderful. Well,
okay.
Thank you so much, Gary. I think that, we have learned more today about how urgent this issue is for our region, how much is at stake, and that we can all take actions together to address this challenge and build more resilient, vibrant communities. We want to point out and invite you to the 2022 Southwest Florida Climate Summit event. It's going to be held April 7th and 8th. It is free, but registration is required. It will be opening up at the chnep.org website in February. So check back then for that. You've heard from so many groups, so many ways to get involved. We're going to have contact information for our different presenters and panelists, as well as a video of today's event available at chnep.org on Monday morning. There you'll also find a Citizens Climate Action Guide, be able to subscribe for our free educational Harbor Happenings magazine and annual nature calendar, and sign up to get involved for notification of citizen science and volunteer opportunities. As we wrap up, I just want to thank all the presenters and panelists today, the members of the Coastal and Heartland National Estuary Partnership staff who worked very hard to facilitate this meeting today, including also our financial major funder, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and all of you attendees for taking time out to learn more about this important subject and how you can be involved. Thank you, and we're going to wrap up here. We can actually have, for those of you who are willing to stay on a few minutes, a quick Q&A with our final panelists. So I'm going to turn it back to them now if they are still on the line, and see if anyone would like to put any questions into menti.com for the final group of panelists. We can go ahead and use the balance of our time, the last few minutes here, to answer any questions that you have. And we do have a few questions, so if each of the panelists can read these, some I see are directed to specific individuals, feel free to jump in, unmute, and answer any you'd like.
Hello. Well, I see one targeted for SS4C. And it's not a question, it's just a statement. Remind policymakers you'll be voting very soon. Yes, we have. Thank you for that suggestion. We do always like to include that just because we have reached a certain age, our brains are still developing, of course. But as we've reached high school, I'm personally in an academic discussion like society, where every week we talk about trending debates and issues and conduct proper research before talking about it. So we do mention that we are coming up to vote to show that we are doing our research and we are getting prepared. I'm pre-registered myself. So yeah, I see another one, Youth Against Climate Change, a similar effort occurring among high school students. Okay, cool. Thank you for letting me know about that cool organization. I will definitely keep that in my head and reach out to you. Thank you.
Salome, I believe there is one directed for you.
Yeah, not a question, just a comment. And I agree, pollution exposure versus what that same group emits is a really powerful imagery. And it's actually why that fact is why I got involved in this fight. So I agree with that comment.
All right, there's another question that just came in.
I can answer that. Yes, I'm in Tallahassee, and before COVID, I used to be in DC as well once a month. and we advocate for different policy solutions, typically at the local level, and a lot around infrastructure funding for local municipal governments and regional bodies to be able to implement some solutions. But yes, that is probably the biggest part of my job.
Well, great. We'll just give it one more minute, see if there's any, oh, one more just came in.
Oh, sure. We actually recently released a report that's called the Florida Future Fund, and it provides speaking points and also some information on environmental racism and historical underrepresentation when talking about infrastructure and resiliency funding. I shared that link on the chat. I use it every single time I talk to legislators, and I encourage everybody to take a look at it and use that as much or as little as you want.
Well, while we're waiting here a minute, I'll just say I am so excited to see so many of you being engaged. I know back in high school, I started like an Amnesty International chapter at my high school, and ended up, going through many years of policy advocacy work. And I just think it's so important for everyone to know that you do make a difference. Every phone call, every email, it really matters. And so, hopefully everyone was inspired today and will find a way to plug in and get further engaged. Yeah, we just really appreciate all the efforts of all of your groups, and you're taking the time to share your information with us today.
Thank you, Jennifer, for everything that you've done to make this possible today, you and your organization.
Well, I'm not seeing any others, so we might be getting out a few minutes early. So anyway, if anyone wants to contact them, again, we'll have all their contact information on our website by Monday, as well as this video and other resources. So feel free to follow up, and thank you again to everyone. Have a good evening.